Hi everyone, welcome to Red Umbrella. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that Peter Griffin isn't just a cartoon character who does random stupid things for laughs. He's actually a psychological case study that reveals patterns of behavior, cognitive issues, and personality traits that real psychologists would recognize and diagnose. By examining how Peter thinks, how he makes decisions, why he acts impulsively, how he treats his family, and what his behavior says about his mental state, we can understand Peter Griffin as someone whose actions follow real psychological patterns that explain almost everything he does. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. The baseline. Who Peter Griffin actually is. Before we can analyze Peter Griffin from a psychological perspective, we need to establish exactly who he is and what his baseline behavior looks like across the show's long history. Peter Griffin is the main character of Family Guy, a show that premiered in 1999 and has been running for over 2 decades. He's a middle-aged man who lives in Quahog, Rhode Island with his wife Lois, their 3 children Meg, Chris, and Stewie, and their talking dog Brian. Peter works at a brewery called Pawtucket Brewery, though his job has changed several times throughout the series. He spends most of his free time drinking beer with his friends at a bar called The Drunken Clam. On the surface, Peter appears to be a typical sitcom dad in the tradition of characters like Homer Simpson or Al Bundy. He's overweight, he's not very smart, he loves beer and television, and he often embarrasses his family with his behavior. Peter takes these characteristics to extremes that go beyond normal sitcom stupidity. His actions aren't just dumb, they're often dangerous, destructive, and completely divorced from normal human reasoning. Understanding the extent of Peter's behavioral problems requires looking at specific examples from the show. In the episode Petarded from season 4, Peter takes an IQ test and discovers that he's what the show calls mentally retarded, though this terminology is outdated and no longer used by psychologists. The episode reveals that Peter's IQ is significantly below average, which would explain many of his poor decisions. The show immediately complicates this by showing that Peter's intelligence varies wildly depending on what the episode needs. Sometimes he can barely tie his shoes, and other times he demonstrates enough intelligence to plan complex schemes or understand sophisticated concepts. This inconsistency in Peter's intelligence is important from a psychological perspective because it suggests that his problems aren't simply about low IQ. A person with genuinely low intelligence would show consistent limitations across all areas of life. Peter doesn't show this consistency. Instead, he shows what psychologists might recognize as severe executive function deficits. These are problems with planning, impulse control, and considering consequences. These deficits combine with what appears to be significant brain damage from years of head injuries and substance abuse. Throughout the series, Peter has suffered countless head injuries. He's been hit by cars, fallen from great heights, crashed through windows, been beaten unconscious, and experienced trauma that would kill or permanently disable most people. In real life, repeated traumatic brain injuries cause cumulative damage that affects personality, impulse control, emotional regulation, and cognitive function. Professional football players who suffer repeated concussions often develop chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, which causes memory problems, confusion, impaired judgment, aggression, depression, and progressive cognitive decline. Peter's behavior shows many symptoms consistent with traumatic brain injury. He has severe memory problems, forgetting major events from his own life, and sometimes not recognizing people he should know. He shows impaired judgment in almost every situation, making decisions that no reasonable person would make. His impulse control is essentially non-existent. When Peter wants to do something, he does it immediately, without considering whether it's safe, legal, or appropriate. His emotional regulation is poor, with Peter shifting from happy to violently angry within seconds, often with no clear trigger. The show depicts Peter getting into physical fights constantly. He has an ongoing feud with a giant chicken named Ernie that results in extended, destructive battles that last several minutes and cause massive property damage. These fights happen because Ernie once gave Peter an expired coupon, which is not a reasonable trigger for violent retaliation. Peter's response to this minor slight is to engage in brutal combat whenever he encounters Ernie, suggesting that his aggression threshold is severely impaired. Peter's relationship with alcohol is another crucial element of his baseline behavior. He drinks beer constantly throughout the series. Almost every scene showing Peter's leisure time involves him drinking, either at home or at the Drunken Clam with his friends. The show treats this heavy drinking as normal and rarely addresses it as a problem. From a psychological and medical perspective, Peter shows clear signs of alcohol use disorder. Alcohol use disorder is diagnosed when someone's drinking causes significant impairment or distress in their life. Peter's drinking definitely causes both. He's shown up to work drunk, made terrible decisions while intoxicated, endangered his family while driving under the influence, and prioritized drinking taking over his responsibilities. He shows increased tolerance, needing to drink more to feel effects. He experiences withdrawal symptoms when he can't drink. He continues drinking despite obvious negative consequences. These are textbook criteria for alcohol use disorder. The combination of possible brain damage and chronic alcohol abuse creates a compounding effect. Alcohol damages the brain over time, particularly affecting the frontal lobe, which controls impulse control, planning, and judgment. When you add alcohol-related brain damage to Peter's existing traumatic brain injuries, you get someone whose ability to function as a responsible adult is severely compromised. This helps explain why Peter's behavior has seemingly gotten worse over the course of the series. Cumulative damage from both sources has progressively impaired his cognitive function. Peter's baseline personality also includes what psychologists would identify as significant narcissistic traits. Narcissism exists on a spectrum, from healthy self-esteem to pathological narcissistic personality disorder. Peter doesn't show all the criteria for full narcissistic personality disorder. He demonstrates several key narcissistic behaviors consistently throughout the series. Peter shows an inflated sense of self-importance, believing that his wants and needs should take priority over everyone else's. He constantly seeks attention and admiration, often through outrageous behavior designed to make himself the center of attention. He shows a lack of empathy, struggling to understand or care about how his actions affect other people. He feels entitled to special treatment and becomes angry when he doesn't receive it. He exploits others to achieve his own goals without considering their feelings. In the episode The Fat Guy Strangler from Season 4, Peter discovers that he has a long-lost sister. His immediate reaction isn't to build a relationship with her or to be happy about finding family he didn't know existed. Instead, he focuses entirely on how this discovery affects him and what he can get from it. When he learns that his sister is wealthy, he tries to exploit her for money. When he discovers she has a mental health condition that causes her to become violent around overweight people, he shows no empathy for her struggle and instead makes the situation about himself. This pattern repeats constantly. When Lois's father dies and she inherits money, Peter immediately spends it on ridiculous purchases for himself without consulting her. When Brian points out that Peter is being selfish, Peter becomes angry and defensive, rather than reflecting on his behavior. When his daughter Meg is clearly suffering from bullying and depression, Peter either ignores it completely or actively makes it worse by joining in the mockery. He cannot see beyond his own immediate wants and feelings to consider how his behavior affects the people around him. Peter also shows what psychologists call poor emotional object constancy, which means he struggles to maintain consistent feelings about people when they're not immediately in front of him. Young children go through a developmental stage where they believe that when their parent leaves the room, the parent has ceased to exist. Most people grow out of this and develop the ability to maintain emotional connections to people, even when those people are absent. Peter seems to struggle with this. He forgets about his wife and children when they're not around. He makes plans and commitments and then completely forgets about them. He starts new friendships with intense enthusiasm and then forgets those people exist when the episode ends. This isn't just normal forgetfulness. It's a pattern of being unable to maintain consistent relationships and emotional bonds when the other person isn't physically present to remind Peter they exist. Peter's baseline also includes a complete inability to delay gratification or think about long-term consequences. The famous marshmallow test in psychology shows children a marshmallow and tells them they can eat it now or wait 15 minutes and get 2 marshmallows. Children who can wait show better life outcomes because they can delay immediate pleasure for greater future rewards. Peter would fail this test every single time. He cannot resist immediate gratification for any reason. When Peter wants something, he pursues it with single-minded focus, regardless of cost or consequence. He quits jobs on impulse without thinking about how he'll pay his bills. He makes large purchases without considering whether he can afford them. He starts projects and schemes without planning how to complete them. He seeks immediate pleasure through food, alcohol, and entertainment without any thought for his health, his family's needs, or his responsibilities. This inability to consider consequences extends to physical safety. Peter regularly does things that could easily kill him, apparently without any awareness that he might die. He's been shown climbing onto his roof, jumping off buildings, challenging people to fights, and engaging in dangerous stunts, all without any apparent concern for his own survival. This suggests either a complete inability to mentally simulate future outcomes, or such severe impulsivity that the simulation doesn't matter. Peter's interactions with his family reveal additional baseline patterns that a psychologist would find significant. He shows what appears to be genuine affection for his wife Lois in some moments. He tells her he loves her, he sometimes tries to do nice things for her, and he occasionally shows remorse when he realizes he's hurt her. These moments suggest that Peter has some capacity for emotional connection and empathy. They're just buried under layers of impulsivity, selfishness, and cognitive impairment that prevent those feelings from consistently guiding his behavior. With his children, Peter shows extremely inconsistent parenting. Sometimes he expresses love and tries to be supportive. Other times he's neglectful or actively cruel, especially toward Meg. This inconsistency could reflect his poor emotional object constancy. When his children are in front of him and doing something that captures his attention, he can access parental feelings. When they're not immediately present, or when something else has his attention, those parental bonds don't influence his behavior. Peter's relationship with his friends also reveals important baseline characteristics. His friend group consists of Joe, a paraplegic police officer, Quagmire, a sex-obsessed pilot, and Cleveland, who was his neighbor before moving away. Peter shows loyalty to these friends in the sense that he spends time with them regularly and sometimes helps them when they ask. He also shows a complete disregard for their feelings and well-being when it conflicts with what he wants. In the episode Jerome is the New Black from Season 8, Peter becomes jealous of his new neighbor Jerome because everyone likes Jerome better than they like Peter. Peter's response to this perceived slight is to try to drive Jerome away through increasingly hostile behavior. He cannot handle not being the center of attention in his friend group. He cannot tolerate someone being more likable than he is. This reaction shows both his narcissistic need for attention and his inability to regulate his emotional responses to perceived threats to his status. Understanding Peter's baseline behavior is crucial for psychological analysis because it establishes the patterns we need to explain. Peter isn't just occasionally stupid or sometimes selfish. He consistently shows severe deficits in impulse control, judgment, empathy, planning, and emotional regulation. He shows signs of brain damage, alcohol use disorder, and narcissistic personality traits. These aren't random character flaws written for comedy. They're consistent patterns that a psychologist could recognize and potentially diagnose if Peter were a real person seeking treatment. The question isn't whether Peter has psychological and cognitive problems. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The real questions are, what specific conditions and diagnoses would best explain the full range of his behavior? What that tells us about his character, and how these patterns have remained consistent or changed throughout the show's long run. A thorough psychological analysis of Peter Griffin requires examining not just what he does, but why his brain allows him to do these things repeatedly without learning or changing. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Establishing Peter's baseline is only the first step. Now we need to examine the specific cognitive deficits that explain why he makes such consistently terrible decisions. Section 2. Executive Dysfunction. Why Peter can't plan anything. Understanding Peter Griffin's inability to function as a responsible adult requires examining what psychologists call executive function. Executive function refers to a set of mental skills that help you manage time, pay attention, switch focus, plan and organize, remember details, and control behavior. These skills are controlled primarily by the frontal lobe of the brain, and damage to this area results in executive dysfunction. Peter shows severe executive dysfunction in almost every area of his life, and examining these deficits helps explain why he acts the way he does. The most obvious sign of Peter's executive dysfunction is his complete inability to plan ahead. Planning requires several cognitive steps. You need to identify a goal, break that goal into smaller steps, organize those steps in a logical order, estimate how long each step will take, and then follow through with the plan while monitoring progress. Peter fails at every single one of these steps in virtually every episode where he attempts to accomplish anything. In the episode Death Has a Shadow from Season 1, Peter accidentally gets drunk at a stag party on a work night and is so hungover the next day that he can't function at his job. This leads to him getting fired. Instead of telling his wife Lois what happened, he starts pretending to go to work every day, while actually spending his time doing nothing productive. This decision makes no sense from a planning perspective, because Peter should be able to predict that Lois will discover the truth eventually, that they need his income to pay bills, and that the longer he waits to address the problem, the worse it will become. Peter doesn't think through any of these obvious consequences. He acts entirely on his immediate desire to avoid the uncomfortable conversation with Lois about getting fired. He has no plan for what he'll do when bills come due, no strategy for finding a new job, and no consideration for how this situation will resolve. When he wins money from a welfare program by committing fraud, he doesn't use it to pay bills or support his family. He buys ridiculous items for himself, again showing no ability to plan for ongoing financial needs. This pattern repeats constantly throughout the series. Peter makes impulsive decisions without any planning. Those decisions create problems, and then instead of developing a thoughtful plan to address those problems, Peter makes more impulsive decisions that make everything worse. He cannot engage in the sequential thinking required for effective planning. Every decision exists in isolation, disconnected from past choices and future consequences. Peter's working memory deficits contribute significantly to his planning problems. Working memory is the system that holds information in your mind while you use it to complete a task. When you're trying to solve a math problem, working memory holds the numbers while you perform calculations. When you're having a conversation, working memory holds what the other person just said while you formulate your response. Peter's working memory appears to be severely impaired. He forgets what people tell him almost immediately. He forgets what he was doing in the middle of doing it. He starts sentences and forgets how he intended to finish them. In the episode Blind Ambition from Season 4, Peter goes completely blind after falling and hitting his head. Even after his vision is restored, he forgets major aspects of what happened during that period. This isn't just normal forgetting. It's an indication of severe memory consolidation problems. The working memory deficits mean that even if Peter could theoretically plan something, he would forget the plan while trying to execute it. He can't hold multiple pieces of information in mind simultaneously, which makes any complex task impossible. This explains why Peter's plans tend to be extremely simple and short-term. He literally cannot conceive of or remember anything more complicated. Peter also shows severe deficits in cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to switch between different tasks or mental frameworks. When something goes wrong with Peter's initial approach to a problem, he cannot pivot to a new strategy. Instead, he either gives up entirely or persists with the failing strategy while getting increasingly frustrated. This inflexibility appears across many episodes. In The Sun Also Draws from Season 1, Peter takes his family to a Native American casino because he promised to take Chris to see a demonstration that doesn't exist. When Peter realizes he made this promise without checking whether the event was real, a person with good cognitive flexibility would apologize, find an alternative activity Chris would enjoy, and make the best of the situation. Peter instead becomes defensive, refuses to admit his mistake, and drags his family on an increasingly miserable trip because he cannot mentally shift from his original flawed plan. This cognitive inflexibility extends to Peter's social interaction. He develops fixed ideas about situations or people and cannot update those ideas when presented with new information. If Peter decides someone is his friend or his enemy, he maintains that stance regardless of how that person actually treats him. If Peter commits to a course of action, he continues with it even when it becomes obviously counterproductive. Peter's impulsivity is perhaps the most prominent manifestation of his executive dysfunction. Impulse control requires the ability to pause between feeling an urge and acting on it, to evaluate whether acting on the urge is appropriate, and to inhibit the action if it's not. This pause, evaluate, inhibit process happens in the frontal lobe, and Peter appears to have almost no ability to execute this process. When Peter thinks of something he wants to do, he does it immediately. He quits his job on impulse when a boss criticizes him. He buys things he can't afford because he wants them right now. He says whatever thought enters his mind without filtering for appropriateness. He acts on sexual urges without considering that he's married and that his wife is present. He starts physical fights over minor disagreements. The time between thought and action is essentially zero. This lack of impulse control appears in both major decisions and minor behaviors. Peter can't resist eating food that's in front of him, even when he's already full, or when the food belongs to someone else. He can't stop himself from touching things he's been told not to touch. He can't prevent himself from making inappropriate comments during serious conversations. Every impulse translates directly into action without any intervening cognitive control. The show has depicted Peter's brain literally trying to control his impulses and failing. In several episodes, we see Peter's brain as a separate character arguing with him, trying to convince him not to do stupid things. Peter's brain will say, "Don't do that, it's a bad idea," and Peter does it anyway. This visual metaphor represents the conflict between impulse and control, showing that Peter has lost the battle for self-regulation. Peter also demonstrates severe deficits in what psychologists call theory of mind, which is the ability to understand that other people have thoughts, feelings, and perspectives different from your own. Most children develop basic theory of mind by age 4 or 5, understanding that what they know isn't necessarily what others know, and that people can have different beliefs or desires. Peter appears to struggle with even this basic concept. He cannot understand that other people see situations differently than he does. When Peter wants something, he assumes everyone else should want to help him get it. When Peter finds something funny, he cannot comprehend why others might not share his amusement. When Peter isn't bothered by something, he dismisses others' concerns as invalid. He literally cannot model other people's mental states effectively enough to predict their reactions or understand their motivations. This theory of mind deficit appears clearly in how Peter treats his daughter Meg. He makes cruel jokes about her appearance and personality, and when she reacts with hurt feelings, Peter seems genuinely confused about why she's upset. He cannot understand that constant mockery from her own father would damage Meg's self-esteem and mental health. The concept that his words affect her emotional state doesn't register in his thinking. The same pattern appears in his marriage to Lois. Peter does things that obviously upset Lois, and he's surprised every time that she's angry. He cannot mentally simulate how Lois will react to his behavior before he does it. Each negative reaction from her is a fresh surprise, as if he's never observed the pattern before. This suggests either a severe theory of mind deficit or such impaired memory that he can't remember previous instances of the same pattern. Peter's inability to shift attention appropriately also contributes to his dysfunction. Attention shifting means being able to move your focus from one thing to another based on what's most important. When you're reading a book and your phone rings, you shift attention from the book to the phone. When you're cooking and smell something burning, you shift attention from what you're chopping to the stove. Peter shows what psychologists call perseveration, which means getting stuck on one thing and being unable to shift away from it. When he becomes focused on an idea, project, or desire, he cannot redirect his attention to other priorities, even when those priorities are objectively more important. If Peter decides he wants to watch a particular television show, the fact that his house is on fire will not successfully shift his attention away from the TV. This perseveration combines with his impulsivity to create a specific pattern. Peter impulsively latches onto an idea, perseverates on that idea to the exclusion of everything else, pursues it with no planning or consideration of consequences, and then moves on to the next impulse when he gets bored or when the current pursuit becomes impossible to continue. This cycle repeats constantly, leaving a trail of abandoned projects, damaged relationships, and unresolved problems. Peter's executive dysfunction also manifests in his complete inability to learn from experience. Learning from mistakes requires several cognitive steps. You need to recognize that something went wrong, identify what specifically you did that contributed to the bad outcome, develop a strategy to avoid that mistake in the future, and then implement that strategy when a similar situation arises. Peter fails at all of these steps. He makes the same mistakes repeatedly with no apparent awareness that he's seen this situation before. He gets fired from jobs multiple times for the same behaviors without ever modifying those behaviors. He hurts his wife's feelings the same way over and over without recognizing the pattern. He starts conflicts with the same people using the same provocations, always seeming surprised when the conflicts escalate. This inability to learn suggests problems with both memory consolidation and abstract thinking. Even if Peter could remember previous instances of making a mistake, he would need to abstract the general principle from those specific instances and apply that principle to new situations. This kind of abstract, generalized learning appears to be beyond his cognitive capabilities. All of these executive function deficits combine to explain why Peter cannot function as a responsible adult, despite being middle-aged with a wife and children depending on him. His inability to plan, remember, control impulses, shift attention, understand others' perspectives, and learn from experience means that he's essentially navigating life with the cognitive tools of a brain-damaged individual with severe developmental delays. The fact that he manages to maintain employment and family relationships at all is actually somewhat remarkable given the extent of his deficits. From a psychological perspective, these executive function problems would likely stem from the combination of factors we identified in his baseline: traumatic brain injuries affecting his frontal lobe, chronic alcohol abuse causing progressive brain damage, and possible developmental issues that were never addressed all contribute to his current state. The question a psychologist would ask isn't, why does Peter behave this way anymore? The question becomes, how has he survived this long with such severe impairments? Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These cognitive deficits explain how Peter thinks and processes information. They don't fully account for his emotional volatility and his tendency toward aggression and violence. Section 3. Emotional dysregulation and aggression. Peter's intense responses. Peter Griffin's emotional responses are as impaired as his cognitive functions, and understanding his emotional dysregulation helps explain some of his most destructive behaviors. Emotional dysregulation refers to difficulty managing emotional responses, including the intensity of emotions, how quickly they change, and how appropriately they match the situation. Peter shows severe emotional dysregulation across multiple areas, and this dysregulation often leads directly to aggression and violence that would be concerning in any real person. The most obvious manifestation of Peter's emotional dysregulation is his explosive anger. Normal emotional regulation involves experiencing anger that's proportional to the triggering event, expressing that anger in socially acceptable ways, and calming down within a reasonable time frame. Peter fails at all three of these steps. He experiences intense rage in response to minor provocations, expresses that rage through violence and destruction, and often stays angry for extended periods without any ability to self-soothe or calm down. In the episode I Never Met the Dead Man from Season 1, Peter becomes obsessed with television to the point where he ignores his family completely. When Meg points out that he's neglecting them, Peter becomes so angry that he refuses to acknowledge the criticism at all. Later in the same episode, when Peter accidentally causes a town-wide power outage, his response to being blamed is immediate defensive rage rather than guilt or concern for the people affected. His anger overwhelms any other emotional response that might be more appropriate to the situation. The intensity of Peter's anger often seems completely disconnected from what triggered it. Small frustrations produce the same level of rage as major betrayals or serious problems. When someone cuts in front of him in line, Peter's anger reaches the same peak as when someone actually harms his family. This lack of proportionality suggests that Peter's emotional response system cannot calibrate intensity based on the severity of the triggering event. Every negative stimulus produces maximum anger, regardless of context. Peter's ongoing feud with the giant chicken Ernie demonstrates both his emotional dysregulation and his tendency toward prolonged, excessive violence. The feud began in the episode Da Boom from Season 2, when Ernie gave Peter an expired coupon. A person with normal emotional regulation might feel brief annoyance at receiving an expired coupon, might ask for a replacement, and would then move on with their life. Peter's response was to become violently angry, and to maintain that anger across multiple encounters spanning years. Every time Peter sees Ernie, they engage in brutal fights that last several minutes, cause massive property damage, and involve both characters suffering injuries that should be fatal. These fights happen in multiple episodes, including Blind Ambition, No Chris Left Behind, and Internal Affairs. The fights are animated to show realistic violence with blood, broken bones, and genuine physical trauma. Peter never questions why he's fighting or considers whether this response is proportional to the original slight. The anger simply activates, and he attacks. These chicken fights reveal something important about Peter's emotional regulation. The fights show that once Peter's anger is triggered, it follows a preset pattern that he cannot interrupt or modify. He doesn't fight the chicken because he's choosing to in each moment. He fights because his anger has been activated and his brain has no mechanism to de-escalate or redirect that energy into less destructive channels. The fight continues until external circumstances force it to stop, not because Peter regains control of his emotions. Peter's emotional dysregulation also manifests as extreme mood swings that happen with no apparent trigger. He can shift from happy and laughing to furiously angry within seconds. He can go from loving and affectionate with Lois to cruel and dismissive just as quickly. These rapid mood shifts suggest instability in the neural systems that regulate emotional states. Normal mood regulation involves some inertia, where your current emotional state influences what you'll feel next. Peter's emotions seem to have no inertia at all, changing randomly based on whatever stimulus he encounters. In the episode Let's Go to the Hop from Season 2, Peter becomes convinced that his son Chris is using drugs at school. Peter's emotional response to this belief cycles rapidly through different states. He's worried, then angry, then determined to go undercover at the school, then excited about reliving his youth, then confused when his plan doesn't work, then angry again when he's discovered. None of these emotions last long enough to actually inform his behavior in useful ways. Each emotion appears, causes a brief action or statement, and then vanishes to be replaced by a different emotion. Peter's inability to regulate sadness and grief is as pronounced as his inability to regulate anger. When Peter experiences loss or disappointment, he often becomes completely non-functional, spiraling into depression-like states that he cannot manage or recover from without external intervention. In the episode Mother Tucker from Season 5, Peter discovers that his mother has died. His grief is so overwhelming and so poorly managed that he becomes unable to function at all, lying in bed and refusing to engage with life. What makes this response notable from a psychological perspective is that Peter cannot modulate his grief. He cannot experience appropriate sadness while still maintaining basic functioning. Instead, the grief completely overwhelms every other system, making him unable to work, care for his family, or attend to basic needs. This all-or-nothing emotional response pattern appears across different emotions, suggesting a fundamental problem with emotional regulation rather than just issues with specific feelings. Peter also shows emotional responses that are completely inappropriate to situations, suggesting that his ability to match emotions to context is impaired. He laughs at funerals, cries during commercials, becomes angry when receiving good news, and shows excitement about tragedies. These mismatched emotional responses indicate that whatever system should be evaluating situations and activating appropriate emotions is not functioning correctly. In the episode Road to the Multiverse from Season 8, Peter and Brian travel through alternate universes and encounter disturbing and dangerous situations. Peter's emotional responses to these situations are often completely wrong for the context. He treats serious dangers as jokes, laughs at things that should frighten him, and shows curiosity about things that should trigger caution. His emotional guidance system provides no useful information about how to respond to his environment. The relationship between Peter's emotional dysregulation and his alcohol use creates a complicated pattern. Alcohol is a depressant that affects emotional regulation, typically making people more emotional, less inhibited, and more likely to act on feelings they would normally suppress. Peter drinks constantly, which means he's almost always in a state where his already impaired emotional regulation is further compromised by intoxication. Peter's drinking appears to serve a self-medication function in some episodes. When he's experiencing emotional distress, he drinks to numb those feelings. When he's experiencing boredom or emptiness, he drinks to create artificial, positive feelings. When he's angry, he drinks, and his anger becomes even more intense and more likely to lead to violence. The alcohol doesn't help him regulate emotions. It makes his dysregulation worse, while temporarily making him care less about the consequences. Peter's aggression extends beyond just the chicken fights to encompass a general pattern of responding to conflict with physical violence. When someone disagrees with him, challenges him, or even just annoys him, Peter's immediate response is often to hit them or fight them. This happens with strangers, with friends, with family members, and with authority figures. The universality of this response suggests that violence is Peter's default conflict resolution strategy. In the episode Lethal Weapons from Season 3, Peter's wife Lois learns martial arts and becomes capable of defending herself physically. Peter's response to Lois gaining this ability is to feel threatened and emasculated. When they get into an argument and Lois uses her martial arts skills to defend herself, Peter's immediate response is to escalate the physical conflict rather than to back down or try to resolve the disagreement verbally. The fact that his own wife can now hurt him doesn't make Peter reconsider using violence. It just makes him more determined to win physical confrontations. Peter's aggression also appears in non-physical forms, including verbal cruelty and psychological manipulation. He says incredibly hurtful things to his daughter Meg, to his wife Lois, and to his friends, seemingly without any awareness of or concern for how his words affect them. This verbal aggression serves the same function as physical aggression in Peter's emotional regulation system. It's a way to express negative emotions without having to actually manage or process those emotions. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10 shows Peter and the family taking drugs and having bad experiences. During Peter's drug-induced state, his behavior becomes even more erratic and aggressive than usual. Meg confronts the family about how they treat her, and Peter's response is to become defensive and angry, rather than to reflect on his behavior. Even in an altered state, where emotional barriers might be lowered, Peter cannot access empathy or genuine self-reflection. Peter's emotional dysregulation affects his ability to experience and express positive emotions as well. His happiness tends to be manic and excessive rather than calm and sustained. When something good happens, Peter becomes overly excited in ways that often lead to problems. He cannot maintain moderate, positive feelings. Everything becomes extreme excitement that burns out quickly and often transitions directly into frustration or anger when the exciting thing ends or doesn't meet his inflated expectations. In the episode PTV from Season 4, Peter starts his own television station broadcasting from home. His excitement about this project is so intense and all-consuming that he ignores every warning sign that he's creating problems. When the FCC shuts down his station, his emotional crash is equally extreme, shifting from manic excitement to complete defeat with no middle ground. Peter experiences emotions at maximum intensity, regardless of whether those emotions are positive or negative. The developmental origins of Peter's emotional dysregulation are hinted at through episodes that show his childhood. In Mother Tucker and other flashback episodes, we see that Peter's father, Francis, was emotionally abusive, highly critical, and physically intimidating. Growing up in an environment where emotional expression was punished and where Peter received inconsistent emotional responses from caregivers could have prevented him from developing normal emotional regulation skills. Children learn emotional regulation partly through modeling their caregivers and partly through receiving appropriate responses to their emotional expressions. If a child cries and the parent comforts them, the child learns that emotions can be managed and that others can help with regulation. If a child cries and the parent ignores them or punishes them, the child doesn't learn these skills. Peter's childhood environment appears to have been one where emotional needs were not met consistently, which could explain why he never developed adult-level emotional regulation. Peter's emotional dysregulation also interacts with his cognitive deficits in ways that make both problems worse. His poor working memory means he can't remember how he felt 5 minutes ago, so he can't use past emotional states to inform current responses. His poor impulse control means that even if he recognizes an emotion is inappropriate, he can't stop himself from acting on it. His inability to learn from experience means he never develops better emotional regulation strategies, even after his dysregulation causes problems. The combination of severe emotional dysregulation, high baseline aggression, poor impulse control, and chronic alcohol intoxication creates a profile that would be deeply concerning in a real person. Peter is essentially emotionally volatile to the point of being dangerous both to himself and to others. His inability to manage anger, modulate emotional intensity, or express feelings in appropriate ways means that he's constantly creating conflict and damage in his relationships. From a clinical psychology perspective, Peter's emotional dysregulation could stem from multiple sources. The traumatic brain injuries we discussed earlier would damage the neural circuits that regulate emotion, particularly in the frontal lobe and limbic system. The alcohol use disorder would further impair these systems. Possible childhood trauma and neglect would have prevented normal emotional development. The combination creates someone whose emotional responses are fundamentally broken in ways that therapy or medication might help, but probably couldn't fully fix, given the extent of the damage. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Peter's emotional volatility explains his outbursts and violence, and when combined with his relationships, we start to see patterns that reveal even deeper psychological issues. Section 4. Attachment Issues and Relationship Dysfunction. Peter Griffin's relationships with the people in his life reveal profound attachment issues and interpersonal dysfunction that would concern any psychologist observing his behavior patterns. Attachment theory, developed by psychologist John Bowlby, explains how early childhood relationships with caregivers shape our ability to form and maintain healthy relationships throughout life. Peter shows signs of what psychologists call disorganized attachment, the most troubled attachment style. characterized by chaotic relationship patterns, difficulty trusting others, and inability to seek or provide emotional support effectively. Peter's relationship with his wife Lois is the most important adult relationship in his life, and it shows severe dysfunction alongside genuine emotional connection. The contradiction in Peter's marriage is that he clearly loves Lois and depends on her, while simultaneously treating her in ways that suggest he doesn't value her at all. This push-pull dynamic, where Peter seeks closeness but then sabotages it through his behavior, is characteristic of disorganized attachment. In the episode Love Thy Trophy from Season 2, Peter and Lois temporarily lose custody of their children due to Peter's negligence. A normal response to this crisis would be to work together as a couple, support each other emotionally, and focus on getting the children back. Peter's actual response is to blame Lois, to avoid dealing with his own role in the situation, and to pursue distractions rather than addressing the problem. When Lois tries to talk to him about her feelings, Peter dismisses her concerns and makes the situation about himself. This pattern repeats throughout the series. Lois tries to communicate her needs, Peter ignores or dismisses them. Lois expresses hurt about Peter's behavior, Peter becomes defensive or angry rather than apologetic. Lois attempts to set boundaries. Peter violates them immediately. The relationship survives not because Peter has good relationship skills, but because Lois has apparently infinite tolerance for his dysfunction, and because the show resets the relationship status at the end of each episode. Peter's inability to maintain emotional intimacy with Lois shows up clearly in episodes that focus on their marriage. In I Take Thee Quagmire from Season 4, Lois's friend Joan gets divorced, and Lois starts questioning her own marriage. Peter's response to Lois's doubts is not to work on the relationship, or to show her why their marriage is worth keeping. Instead, he takes her to a marriage counselor, but spends the session making jokes and not taking the process seriously. He cannot engage with genuine emotional vulnerability, even when his marriage is at stake. The episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie from Season 6 are fantasy episodes where Stewie imagines killing his mother and the aftermath. While these episodes are not canon, they reveal something about how the show views Peter's relationship with Lois. In Stewie's imagination, when Lois dies, Peter remarries almost immediately and shows little genuine grief. This fantasy reflects a truth about Peter's attachment style. He needs someone to take care of him, but he doesn't maintain deep emotional bonds that would persist through separation or loss. Peter's relationship with his children shows even more severe attachment dysfunction. Normal parent-child attachment involves the parent providing consistent care, emotional support, and protection while the child develops trust and security. Peter fails at almost all aspects of parental attachment. He's inconsistent, sometimes engaged, and sometimes completely neglectful. He provides physical care irregularly. He offers almost no emotional support. He frequently endangers his children through his poor judgment. His treatment of Meg is particularly troubling from an attachment perspective. Meg is Peter's oldest child, and a healthy father-daughter relationship would involve Peter protecting Meg's self-esteem, supporting her development, and providing a secure base from which she can explore the world. Peter does the opposite. He actively undermines Meg's self-esteem through constant insults. He joins in when others mock her. He forgets about her existence for extended periods. He shows favoritism toward his other children, particularly Chris. In the episode Seahorse Seashell Party mentioned earlier, Meg confronts the family about their treatment of her. She points out that Peter has psychologically abused her for years, that he's made her feel worthless, and that his behavior has damaged her mental health. Peter's response is not remorse or acknowledgement. He becomes angry at being confronted and tries to make Meg feel guilty for speaking up. This response shows a complete inability to take responsibility for how his parenting has affected his child. Peter's relationship with Chris is less overtly cruel, but still shows attachment dysfunction. Peter sometimes treats Chris like a friend or buddy, rather than like a son who needs guidance and structure. Other times, Peter completely ignores Chris or forgets he exists. There's no consistency in their relationship, which would make it difficult for Chris to develop a secure attachment to his father. Chris can't predict whether Peter will be supportive, neglectful, or harmful at any given moment. The relationship between Peter and his infant son Stewie is almost non-existent. Peter rarely interacts with Stewie in meaningful ways. He seems to forget that Stewie is part of the family for entire episodes. When he does interact with Stewie, it's usually to hand him off to Lois, or to use him as a prop in whatever scheme Peter is pursuing. The lack of father-infant bonding would be concerning in a real family, as early attachment in infancy affects emotional development throughout life. Peter's friendships also reveal attachment issues, though they're less severe than his family relationships. His friend group consists of Joe, Quagmire, and previously Cleveland. These friendships have persisted for years, suggesting Peter can maintain some long-term relationships. The friendships are shallow and activity-based, rather than emotionally intimate. The men drink together, watch television together, and sometimes help each other with practical problems, but they rarely, if ever, discuss feelings or provide genuine emotional support. In the episode Jerome is the New Black from Season 8, Peter's response to his friend Cleveland moving away and being replaced by a new neighbor named Jerome shows his attachment issues clearly. Peter doesn't grieve Cleveland's absence or work to maintain the friendship over distance. Instead, he immediately tries to bond with Jerome to fill the gap Cleveland left. When Jerome turns out to be more likable than Peter, Peter becomes jealous and tries to drive Jerome away. Peter needs people around him, but he can't form deep attachments that would survive challenges or changes. Peter's relationship with his own father, Francis, reveals the roots of many of his attachment issues. Francis was emotionally distant, highly critical, and occasionally physically abusive. In the episode Death Lives from Season 3, we see flashbacks showing Francis berating young Peter and making him feel inadequate. In The Father, the Son, and the Holy Fawns from Season 4, Francis's rigid, authoritarian parenting style is shown in detail. This kind of parenting creates what attachment researchers call an insecure avoidant or disorganized attachment pattern. Children who grow up with critical, unpredictable, or abusive parents often develop one of two responses. Some become extremely anxious in relationships, constantly seeking reassurance and fearing abandonment. Others become avoidant, struggling to trust people and keeping emotional distance. Peter shows elements of both patterns, which is why his attachment style appears disorganized. He needs people and depends on them, particularly Lois, but he also can't trust them fully or treat them in ways that would maintain healthy relationships. After Francis dies in the episode Mother Tucker from Season 5, Peter's grief response shows his complicated feelings about his father. He experiences genuine sadness, but he also can't fully process the loss because his relationship with Francis was so troubled. He never received the approval or love he wanted from his father, and now he never will. This unresolved attachment wound affects how Peter relates to his own children, repeating the cycle of inadequate parenting he experienced. Peter's relationship with his mother Thelma, shown in the same episode and others, contrasts sharply with his relationship with Francis. Thelma was warm and affectionate, providing the emotional support that Francis withheld. Peter's attachment to his mother appears more secure, and when she dies, his grief is more straightforward and profound. This shows that Peter is capable of forming genuine attachments when the other person provides consistent emotional availability. The problem is that Peter himself cannot provide that consistency to others. Peter's attachment issues also appear in how he responds to separation and abandonment. Normal secure attachment allows people to maintain emotional bonds even when physically separated from loved ones. Peter seems to struggle with this. When Lois leaves, or when Peter thinks she might leave, he either becomes clingy and desperate, or he immediately seeks replacement relationships. He cannot maintain a secure internal representation of Lois when she's not present. In the episode The Perfect Castaway from Season 4, Peter goes on a fishing trip that extends for months when the boat gets stranded. When Peter finally returns home, he discovers that Lois has remarried, believing Peter was dead. Peter's response to this situation shows both his attachment needs and his dysfunction. He wants Lois back immediately, but he also can't articulate why or express his feelings effectively. He resorts to schemes and manipulation rather than honest emotional communication. Peter's inability to seek emotional support appropriately is another sign of attachment dysfunction. People with secure attachment can identify when they need help, ask for it clearly, and accept support when offered. Peter either doesn't recognize when he needs help, refuses help when it's offered, or seeks help in inappropriate ways that push people away. He cannot navigate the give and take of mutual support that healthy relationships require. In the episode Blind Ambition from Season 4, when Peter loses his vision, he needs significant help to function. Instead of accepting help gracefully and working to adapt to his disability, Peter becomes demanding, ungrateful, and abusive toward the people trying to help him. His blindness makes him dependent, which triggers anxiety about his attachment needs, and he responds by pushing away the very people he depends on. Peter's relationships also show poor boundaries, another sign of attachment issues. He doesn't respect other people's physical or emotional boundaries, invading their space, demanding their time and attention, and ignoring their stated limits. At the same time, he can't maintain his own boundaries, agreeing to things he doesn't want to do, allowing people to take advantage of him, and failing to protect himself from exploitation. The episode Peterotica from Season 4 shows Peter writing erotic novels and sharing them publicly without considering how this might affect his family's reputation or his children's well-being. He cannot see that his actions have implications for the people attached to him. His poor boundaries mean he doesn't protect his family from the consequences of his behavior, and he doesn't recognize when he should keep certain activities private. Peter's attachment dysfunction creates a cycle that perpetuates his other problems. Because he can't form secure attachments, he doesn't have a strong support system that could help him address his cognitive deficits, emotional dysregulation, or substance abuse. Because his relationships are unstable, he experiences chronic stress that worsens his brain function and emotional control. Because he can't communicate effectively with loved ones, problems escalate instead of getting resolved. Lois represents Peter's primary attachment figure in adulthood, essentially functioning as both wife and mother to him. She manages his life, cleans up his messes, and provides the emotional regulation he cannot provide for himself. This parentified relationship dynamic is not healthy for either partner. Lois takes on too much responsibility for managing Peter, and Peter never develops adult attachment capabilities because Lois's caretaking enables his dysfunction. From a psychological treatment perspective, Peter's attachment issues would be among the most difficult problems to address. Attachment patterns form early in life and become deeply ingrained. Changing them requires consistent therapeutic work over years, including processing childhood trauma, developing new relationship skills, and practicing secure attachment behaviors. Given Peter's cognitive impairments, emotional dysregulation, and lack of insight into his own problems, traditional attachment-focused therapy would face significant obstacles. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Understanding Peter's attachment dysfunction and relationship patterns helps explain his behavior, and these issues become even clearer when we examine how he fails to show insight into his own problems. Section 5. Alcohol use and social behavior. How drinking shapes Peter's world. Peter Griffin's relationship with alcohol represents one of the most consistent patterns in his life, and examining his drinking alongside his social behaviors reveals how substance use and interpersonal dysfunction create a reinforcing cycle. Alcohol appears in nearly every aspect of Peter's daily routine, from his evenings at the Drunken Clam bar with his friends, to casual drinking at home while watching television. This pattern extends across the entire series, appearing in early episodes from the first season and continuing unchanged through later seasons. The consistency suggests this is not occasional social drinking, but rather a deeply ingrained behavioral pattern where alcohol functions as the centerpiece of Peter's social world and his primary method of relaxation and escape. The Drunken Clam serves as Peter's second home throughout the series. In countless episodes spanning all seasons, we see Peter sitting at the bar with his friends Joe Swanson, Glenn Quagmire, and formerly Cleveland Brown. They drink beer together for hours, talking about their lives, making jokes, and simply occupying the same space. The bar provides structure to Peter's free time in a way that few other activities do. After work, Peter goes to the Drunken Clam. On weekends, Peter goes to the Drunken Clam. When Peter has a problem or needs to think, he goes to the Drunken Clam. The predictability of this routine suggests that alcohol consumption has become deeply embedded in how Peter organizes his daily life and finds meaning in his free time. In the episode Death Has a Shadow from Season 1, we see an early example of how Peter's drinking creates problems in his life. Peter attends a bachelor party for a coworker and drinks heavily throughout the evening. The next morning, he arrives at work, severely hungover, unable to focus or perform his job duties. His supervisor notices Peter's impaired state, and the situation escalates until Peter ends up getting fired from his position at the toy factory. What makes this situation particularly significant from a psychological perspective is Peter's response to losing his job. He doesn't reflect on how his drinking led to this consequence. He doesn't consider reducing his alcohol consumption to prevent similar problems in the future. Instead, he hides the job loss from his wife Lois and continues his normal drinking routine as if nothing has changed. This response shows that even when drinking causes serious negative consequences, Peter doesn't connect his behavior to those outcomes in a way that would motivate change. The episode Friends of Peter G from Season 9 provides one of the most direct examinations of Peter's alcohol use in the entire series. After Peter drives drunk and causes a serious accident that leaves his friend unconscious in a coma, he faces legal consequences and is court-ordered to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. During these meetings, Peter sits in a circle with other people struggling with alcohol problems and hears them share stories about how alcohol damaged their lives, destroyed their relationships, and caused them to hurt people they loved. For a brief period, Peter recognizes similarities between their stories and his own life. He acknowledges that he drinks too much and that his drinking has consequences that extend beyond just himself. What happens after this moment of recognition reveals important aspects of Peter's psychology and his social environment. Peter attends several AA meetings and temporarily stops drinking. During his period of sobriety, he becomes more aware of how much drinking shaped his social life and his daily routines. The structure he relied on disappears. The easy social activity he used to fill his evenings vanishes. Peter notices that his friends are uncomfortable around sober Peter. They don't know how to interact with him without alcohol as the mediator of their social interactions. Joe makes comments suggesting that sober Peter is less fun to be around. Quagmire mentions feeling judged by Peter's sobriety. Peter himself feels awkward and unsure how to fill the time he used to spend drinking. The discomfort of sobriety, combined with social pressure from his environment, eventually leads Peter back to drinking. The episode demonstrates that Peter briefly understood his problem, but lacked the sustained motivation, internal resources, or external support system needed to maintain behavioral change over the long term. Peter's drinking patterns show several concerning features that appear repeatedly across episodes throughout the series. He drinks in the morning before work, as shown in multiple episodes where he's depicted having a beer with breakfast or taking a drink before leaving the house. He drinks during his lunch breaks at work. He drinks immediately after work and continues drinking through the evening until he goes to sleep. He drinks alone at home, and he drinks in groups at the bar. He drinks when he's happy, celebrating good news with alcohol. He drinks when he's sad, using alcohol to cope with disappointment or distress. The drinking happens regardless of context, emotional state, or time of day, suggesting it has become an automatic behavior rather than a conscious choice made in response to specific situations. The amount Peter drinks is also noteworthy when examining his behavioral patterns. In scenes at the Drunken Clam, we often see Peter and his friends sitting surrounded by multiple empty beer bottles, indicating they've consumed numerous drinks in a single session. Peter rarely appears to experience significant impairment from this drinking, which suggests tolerance has developed. Tolerance means the body adapts to regular alcohol exposure and requires increasing amounts to feel the same effects. The fact that Peter can drink quantities that would severely impair someone who drinks less frequently indicates his body has adapted to chronic alcohol consumption. This physiological adaptation is one marker that distinguishes heavy, regular drinking from occasional social drinking. Peter's social circle reinforces his drinking rather than challenging it or encouraging moderation. Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland all drink alongside Peter at the Drunken Clam, with similar frequency and volume. None of them question whether drinking this frequently is healthy or problematic. The group has established a norm where heavy drinking is expected and accepted. When Peter briefly tried sobriety in Friends of Peter G, his friends initially offered verbal support, but their behavior quickly revealed discomfort with the change. Quagmire complained that sober Peter was judgmental of their continued drinking. Joe mentioned that Peter wasn't as fun or entertaining anymore. The group dynamic depended on shared drinking, and removing alcohol from the equation threatened the foundation of their friendships and the way they related to each other. This social reinforcement represents a significant barrier to any potential behavioral change. Peter's primary social relationships exist within a context where heavy drinking is normalized and expected as part of participation in the group. To change his drinking patterns, Peter would need to either change his entire social circle or convince his existing friends to change their behaviors alongside him. Neither option seems likely, given Peter's strong attachment to his friendships and his friends' investment in maintaining their established drinking routine. The social environment essentially locks Peter into his current pattern by making sobriety socially costly and continuing to drink socially rewarding. The episode The Thin White Line from Season 3 shows another dimension of Peter's relationship with alcohol and substances more broadly. When Brian becomes addicted to cocaine in this episode, Peter and the family stage an intervention to help Brian recognize his problem and seek treatment. The irony of Peter intervening in someone else's substance use while maintaining his own heavy drinking pattern goes unremarked upon in the episode. Peter apparently sees Brian's cocaine use as a problem, while viewing his own constant alcohol consumption as normal and acceptable. This selective awareness suggests Peter has no framework for recognizing his own drinking as potentially problematic. He can identify substance abuse when it involves illegal drugs used by others, but cannot apply the same lens to his own legal substance use. Peter's drinking also intersects with his impulsivity and emotional dysregulation in concerning ways. Alcohol lowers inhibitions and impairs judgment in anyone who drinks. But these effects compound Peter's already severe deficits in impulse control and decision-making. When Peter drinks, his already poor impulse control becomes even worse. His emotional reactions become more extreme and less predictable. His decision-making becomes more reckless and short-sighted. In the episode Mission Impossible from Season 3, Peter gets drunk and makes a bet that leads to Lois becoming pregnant with their third child. The decision to have another baby happens impulsively while Peter is intoxicated, with no consideration of whether they actually want another child or can afford to raise 3 children. The social aspect of Peter's drinking serves multiple psychological functions that help explain why the pattern persists despite negative consequences. First, it provides a ready-made social activity that requires minimal emotional engagement or vulnerability. Peter and his friends can sit together drinking for hours without having meaningful conversations or sharing genuine feelings. The alcohol facilitates being in physical proximity to others while avoiding real intimacy or emotional exposure. Second, drinking together creates a sense of bonding and shared experience without requiring actual emotional connection or mutual understanding. The men feel close because they're doing this activity together regularly, even though they rarely, if ever, discuss anything personal or emotionally significant. Peter's home drinking shows different patterns than his bar drinking, but raises similar concerns about function and frequency. At home, Peter often drinks while watching television, creating a strong association between alcohol and passive entertainment. In the episode And the Wiener Is from Season 3, Peter sits on the couch drinking beer and watching TV while ignoring his family's needs and activities happening around him. The drinking at home seems to serve an escape function, helping Peter disengage from family responsibilities and demands on his attention. It creates a bubble where he can zone out and avoid the emotional or practical work of engaging with his wife and children. Lois's response to Peter's drinking has varied across episodes, but generally falls into a pattern of acceptance with occasional complaints. She sometimes expresses frustration about Peter spending too much time at the bar or coming home drunk, but she rarely imposes meaningful consequences or demands sustained change. In the episode The Kiss Seen Around the World from Season 3, Lois expresses frustration about Peter's behavior, but ultimately accepts his apology without requiring him to modify his drinking patterns or his time spent away from home. This pattern of complaint followed by acceptance allows Peter to continue his drinking routine without facing serious pressure to change from his primary relationship. The episode Wasted Talent from Season 2 reveals another aspect of how alcohol functions in Peter's life. Peter discovers he has a special talent for playing piano, but this talent only manifests when he's drunk. The discovery leads to situations where Peter's abilities are dependent on being intoxicated. The episode treats Peter's alcohol-dependent talent as amusing and entertaining rather than concerning. This framing normalizes the idea that alcohol can be necessary for Peter to access certain capabilities, which reinforces rather than challenges his drinking patterns. Peter's relationship with his children shows the impact of his drinking and social patterns on his family dynamics and his role as a parent. In multiple episodes across different seasons, Peter chooses drinking with his friends over spending time with his kids. He prioritizes his bar routine over attending school events, helping with homework, or being present for family activities. In Road to Rhode Island from Season 2, Peter is largely absent from the main storyline because he's engaged in his typical routine of work and drinking. His children navigate their own adventures and problems, while Peter remains peripheral, occupied with his own social drinking rituals. This pattern suggests that Peter's drinking and bar time take priority over active parenting and engagement with his children's lives. Before we move on, Make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These patterns in Peter's drinking and social habits reveal themselves even more clearly when we examine how he communicates, because his language use and interaction styles show just how deeply his social dysfunction runs. Section 6. Dialogue Patterns and Social Cues. What Peter's Words Reveal. Peter Griffin's communication style reveals significant deficits in social cognition and pragmatic language use. The way Peter talks to others, the content of what he says, and his ability to recognize and respond to social cues all point to fundamental problems with understanding how communication functions in social contexts. These issues appear consistently across his interactions with family members, friends, authority figures, and strangers, suggesting they represent core features of how Peter's mind processes social information rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment. The most striking feature of Peter's communication is his frequent disregard for politeness norms and social appropriateness. Politeness in language isn't just about saying please and thank you. It encompasses a complex system of strategies people use to maintain social harmony, show respect, and avoid causing offense. Peter regularly violates these norms in ways that create conflict and damage his relationships. He says things that are rude, offensive, or hurtful, apparently without recognizing how his words will affect the listener, or without caring about those effects. Peter's treatment of his daughter Meg through his language provides clear examples of this pattern. In numerous episodes across all seasons, Peter makes cruel comments about Meg's appearance, intelligence, and worth as a person. In the episode Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10, Meg finally confronts the family about years of verbal abuse, directly addressing how Peter's constant insults have damaged her self-esteem and mental health. Peter's response to this confrontation is defensive and dismissive rather than apologetic or reflective. He cannot acknowledge that his words have power to hurt others, or he simply doesn't care that they do. The linguistic concept of face-threatening acts is relevant here. Face refers to a person's public self-image and their desire to be respected and valued by others. When someone insults you, criticizes you, or dismisses you, they threaten your face. In normal conversation, people use various strategies to minimize face threats, like softening criticism with compliments or framing requests politely. Peter does the opposite. He maximizes face threats by making insults direct and harsh, offering no softening or mitigation, and often delivering them publicly where others can witness the humiliation. Peter's communication with his wife Lois shows similar patterns of face threat and disrespect, though complicated by moments of affection and appreciation. In the episode The Story on Page 1 from Season 2, Peter decides to become a journalist and writes an article about Lois without her knowledge or consent. The article reveals private information and portrays Lois in unflattering ways. When Lois confronts Peter about violating her privacy and dignity, Peter doesn't understand why she's upset. He thought the article was good and can't grasp that exposing someone's private life without permission is a violation, regardless of how well written the article might be. Peter's inability to recognize when he's being inappropriate extends to his communication with authority figures. In the episode E. Peterbus Unum from Season 2, Peter interacts with government officials while declaring his property an independent nation. He speaks to them with the same casual disrespect he shows everyone else, apparently not recognizing that speaking to a government representative requires different communication strategies than speaking to his drinking buddies. This failure to code switch, to adjust his language based on the social context, appears throughout Peter's interactions. The concept of conversational implicature is also relevant to understanding Peter's communication problems. Implicature refers to meaning that's implied rather than stated directly. When someone says, "It's getting late," during a party at their house, they're implying that guests should probably leave soon. They're not saying it directly because that would be rude, but the implication is clear to most adults. Peter frequently misses these implied meanings, taking statements at their literal surface level and missing the social messages underneath. In the episode The Courtship of Stewie's Father from Season 4, Peter joins a children's group and interacts with other parents. During these interactions, the other parents make polite small talk and subtle hints about their feelings and preferences. Peter responds to everything literally, missing the implied meanings and social signals. When someone says, "That's interesting," in a tone that clearly means they want the conversation to end, Peter keeps talking, not recognizing the cue to stop. This inability to read conversational implicature makes Peter's interactions awkward and frustrating for the people trying to communicate with him. Peter's turn-taking in conversation also shows problems. Normal conversation follows an implicit structure where people take turns speaking, listen while others talk, and respond in ways that build on what was just said. Peter frequently interrupts, changes topics without transition, and responds to what he wants to talk about rather than what the other person actually said. In the episode The King is Dead from Season 2, Peter has conversations with Lois where he clearly isn't listening to her responses. He asks questions and then talks over her answers, or he responds to something she said several exchanges ago rather than her most recent statement. The content of Peter's speech also reveals cognitive and social issues. He frequently makes non sequiturs, statements that have no logical connection to the conversation happening around them. He'll be discussing one topic and suddenly make a comment about something completely unrelated, then seem confused when others don't follow his jump in topics. This suggests that Peter's internal thought process is disorganized, and that he lacks the metacognitive awareness to recognize when his external speech doesn't match the shared conversational context. Peter's use of humor in conversation frequently crosses lines into offense without apparent awareness. He makes jokes that are racist, sexist, or cruel, and when people react negatively, he seems genuinely surprised. In the episode When You Wish Upon a Weinstein from Season 3, Peter makes jokes based on ethnic stereotypes and doesn't understand why people find them offensive. He appears to lack the social awareness to recognize that certain topics and certain types of humor are inappropriate in polite company, or that his particular execution of jokes makes them more offensive than humorous. The pragmatic function of apologies is another area where Peter shows deficits. When Peter does something wrong and someone is upset with him, he sometimes offers apologies. These apologies rarely sound sincere or demonstrate understanding of what he did wrong. He'll say, "I'm sorry," while simultaneously defending his actions or minimizing their impact. In the episode Jungle Love from Season 4, Peter apologizes to Lois for various transgressions, but immediately follows the apologies with justifications for why he did what he did. This pattern suggests Peter doesn't understand that a genuine apology involves taking responsibility without excuses. Peter's communication with strangers shows the same deficits as his communication with family and friends, indicating these are stable patterns rather than issues specific to particular relationships. In the episode Lethal Weapons from Season 3, Peter interacts with various people in public settings and consistently violates social norms. He makes personal comments to strangers, asks inappropriate questions, and shares information about himself that normal social boundaries would keep private. He appears to lack the filter that helps most people distinguish between thoughts that should be spoken aloud and thoughts that should remain internal. The linguistic concept of deixis relates to how language connects to context through words like here, there, now, then, I, and you. These words only have meaning in relation to when and where they're spoken and who's speaking. Peter sometimes uses deictic terms in ways that suggest he's not fully tracking the conversational context. He'll refer to events as happening now when they happened in the past, or use here and there in ways that don't match the physical reality of where he and his conversation partner are located. Peter's speech also shows limited vocabulary and syntactic complexity compared to what would be expected for an adult. He uses simple sentence structures and common words, rarely employing the kind of sophisticated language that would indicate advanced verbal intelligence. This limited linguistic capacity could stem from his cognitive deficits, his lack of education, or both. In the episode Petarded from Season 4, when Peter takes an IQ test, his language use during the testing session shows difficulty with abstract terms and complex grammatical constructions. The episode Road to the Multiverse from Season 8 provides examples of Peter trying to communicate in unfamiliar contexts where his usual patterns don't work. When Peter and Brian travel through alternate universes with different communication norms, Peter doesn't adapt his language to match these new contexts. He continues using the same communication strategies that work poorly even in his home universe. This inflexibility suggests that Peter has a limited repertoire of communication strategies and lacks the metacognitive awareness to recognize when his approach isn't working. Peter's nonverbal communication also contributes to his social difficulties. He stands too close to people, invading their personal space. He makes inappropriate facial expressions during serious conversations. His body language often doesn't match the emotional content of what he's saying. These mismatches between verbal and nonverbal communication create confusion for listeners trying to interpret Peter's meaning and intentions. In the episode Brian Sings and Swings from Season 4, Peter's body language during an important conversation with Lois sends signals that contradict his verbal message, making it difficult for Lois to know whether he's being sincere. Peter's response to direct communication from others about his behavior shows his difficulty processing feedback. When someone tells Peter clearly and directly that his behavior is problematic, he often responds with confusion, defensiveness, or dismissal. He doesn't incorporate the feedback into his understanding of himself or modify his behavior accordingly. In the episode Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q from Season 10, Quagmire explicitly tells Peter that his communication style is inappropriate for the serious situation they're dealing with. Peter hears these words but doesn't process them in a way that changes his subsequent communication. The social function of gossip and social information sharing is something Peter engages in but handles poorly. He shares information that should be kept confidential. He passes along gossip without considering whether it's true or how sharing it might harm people. He doesn't understand the implicit rules about what information can be shared with whom and under what circumstances. In the episode To Love and Die in Dixie from Season 3, Peter's testimony in court reveals information he should have kept private, demonstrating his inability to recognize boundaries around information sharing. Peter's communication during conflicts shows particular dysfunction. When Peter disagrees with someone, his approach is often to become louder and more aggressive, rather than to engage in constructive dialogue. He doesn't ask clarifying questions to understand the other person's perspective. He doesn't acknowledge valid points the other person makes. He doesn't work toward compromise or mutual understanding. Instead, he asserts his position repeatedly, escalates emotionally, and sometimes resorts to physical aggression when verbal conflict doesn't resolve in his favor. The episode 15 Minutes of Shame from Season 2 shows Peter dealing with media attention and public communication. When Peter has opportunities to communicate with broader audiences through television and media, he doesn't adjust his communication style for this context. He speaks to cameras and reporters the same way he speaks to his drinking buddies, not recognizing that mass media communication requires different strategies than interpersonal communication. This failure to recognize contextual demands shows up across various communication situations Peter encounters. Peter's linguistic and communication patterns reflect his broader cognitive and social deficits. His inability to recognize social cues connects to his theory of mind deficits and his failure to model other people's mental states. His inappropriate language connects to his poor impulse control and his inability to filter thoughts before speaking. His communication inflexibility connects to his general cognitive inflexibility and his difficulty adapting to new contexts. All of these communication problems stem from the same underlying psychological and neurological issues that affect other aspects of his functioning. The long-term consequences of Peter's communication dysfunction appear in his damaged relationships and social isolation. People don't enjoy talking with Peter because he's rude, he doesn't listen, and he makes conversations uncomfortable. His family members have learned to expect insults and dismissiveness from him. His friendships remain shallow, partly because his communication style prevents deeper connection. His employment problems stem partly from his inability to communicate appropriately with supervisors and colleagues. The communication deficits create a cycle where poor social skills lead to negative social outcomes, which provide no opportunity to develop better skills, which perpetuate the dysfunction. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this break. These patterns of poor communication and social awareness don't just affect his relationships, they also shape how Peter interprets the world around him and how that warped perspective creates the foundation for the show's comedic structure. Section 7. Cognitive Framing and Humor Mechanisms. How Peter's mind creates comedy. Peter Griffin's way of interpreting reality creates much of the comedy in Family Guy, and examining how his mind frames situations reveals interesting patterns about cognition and humor construction. Cognitive framing refers to the mental structures people use to understand and interpret their experiences. Most adults develop relatively stable frameworks for understanding cause and effect, social relationships, moral principles, and how the world works. Peter's cognitive frameworks appear unstable, illogical, and sometimes completely inverted from normal reasoning. This cognitive distortion creates comedic situations because viewers recognize the gap between Peter's interpretation and reality. The humor in Family Guy often depends on Peter reaching conclusions that no reasonable person would reach from the same information. When presented with a situation, Peter's mind processes it through frameworks that produce bizarre interpretations. These interpretations then guide his actions, leading to consequences that seem inevitable to viewers, but apparently surprise Peter every time. The comedy emerges from watching someone navigate the world with a fundamentally broken interpretive system, while remaining confident that their understanding is correct. In the episode Peter's Two Dads from Season 5, Peter discovers that the man he thought was his father might not be his biological parent. A normal person processing this information would feel confused, perhaps seek clarification, and try to understand their family history. Peter's cognitive framework interprets this situation in much stranger ways. He decides that Francis Griffin couldn't be his father because they're too different, without considering that parents and children often have different personalities. His reasoning jumps to wild conclusions without following logical steps that would connect evidence to interpretation. Peter's interpretation of social situations shows similar distortions. When someone behaves in a particular way, Peter assigns meanings and motivations that often have no connection to what actually happened. In the episode The Story on Page 1 from Season 2, Peter becomes a journalist and writes stories about people in his community. His articles consistently misinterpret people's actions and statements. He frames innocent behaviors as scandalous. He assigns malicious intent where none exists. He creates narratives that serve his desired story rather than accurately representing reality. This pattern suggests Peter's cognitive framework prioritizes internal narrative construction over external truth. The way Peter frames cause and effect relationships reveals fundamental problems with his reasoning. Normal causal reasoning involves recognizing that certain actions lead to predictable consequences. You can trace backwards from an outcome to identify what caused it. You can predict forwards from an action to anticipate what will happen. Peter appears to lack this causal framework in many situations. He does things without anticipating consequences. When bad things happen, he doesn't connect them to his prior actions. His mind doesn't organize events into coherent causal chains. In the episode Petarded from Season 4, after Peter discovers his low IQ, he uses this information to justify avoiding responsibility for his actions. His cognitive framework interprets having low intelligence as permission to behave however he wants without consequences. This interpretation inverts normal logic. Most people would think that knowing you have cognitive limitations means you should be more careful and thoughtful. Peter's framework produces the opposite conclusion. This inversion creates humor because viewers recognize the faulty reasoning, while Peter operates as if his logic is sound. Peter's understanding of time and sequence also shows distortions. He references past events incorrectly. He misremembers the order in which things happened. He makes plans for the future without considering how long tasks actually take. In the episode Road to Rhode Island from Season 2, Peter's timeline for various activities makes no sense. He believes he can accomplish things in timeframes that are physically impossible. His cognitive framework for understanding duration and sequence doesn't match reality. This creates situations where Peter is constantly surprised by how long things take, or confused about when events occurred. The show uses Peter's distorted cognitive framing to set up comedic reversals. A comedic reversal happens when a situation develops in the opposite direction from what's expected. Peter's interpretations create expectations that reality then contradicts. In the episode I Never Met the Dead Man from Season 1, Peter becomes obsessed with television, and his framework for understanding priorities gets completely inverted. He values television watching above family relationships, personal hygiene, and employment. Normal hierarchy of needs gets flipped. The comedy comes from watching someone operate with values that are backwards from normal human priorities. Peter's moral reasoning shows particularly interesting cognitive framing. Most adults have developed frameworks for understanding right and wrong that involve principles like honesty, fairness, and not harming others. Peter's moral framework seems to prioritize different things. His own immediate desires matter most. Social rules matter only when breaking them would have immediate negative consequences for him. Other people's welfare enters his moral calculations inconsistently or not at all. This framework produces behavior that violates normal moral intuitions in ways that create comedic shock. In the episode Holy Crap from Season 2, Peter's father Francis visits and Peter must navigate the relationship. Peter's framework for understanding father-son obligations appears confused and contradictory. He feels he should respect and obey his father because that's what children do. He also resents his father's criticism and wants to prove himself. These competing frameworks create internal conflict that Peter cannot resolve through reasoning. Instead, he swings between different behavioral patterns without a coherent understanding of what the relationship should be. Peter's framework for understanding his own abilities and limitations is severely distorted. He consistently overestimates what he's capable of doing. When he decides to pursue some new activity or skill, his cognitive framework tells him he can succeed, despite having no relevant experience or talent. This distortion appears across countless episodes where Peter takes on challenges he's completely unqualified for. In the episode The King is Dead from Season 2, Peter takes over directing a play, despite having no theater experience. His framework interprets his enthusiasm and ideas as equivalent to actual knowledge and skill. The relationship between Peter's cognitive framing and the show's cutaway gags is worth examining. Family Guy is famous for its cutaway gags, where the narrative pauses to show an unrelated scene, usually based on something Peter said. Peter will make a reference or comparison, and then we see a visual representation of that reference. These cutaways often reveal how Peter's mind makes associations. The connections he draws between current situations and past experiences or cultural references follow unusual pathways. His associative network links ideas that most people wouldn't connect. In the episode Brian Wallows and Peter's Swallows from Season 3, Peter develops a medical condition, and his framework for understanding what's happening to his body produces strange interpretations. He doesn't think about seeking medical care or understanding the biological causes. Instead, his mind jumps to supernatural or fantastical explanations. This pattern appears whenever Peter faces situations requiring medical or scientific understanding. His cognitive framework doesn't include robust models of how bodies work or what causes physical symptoms. Peter's interpretation of social hierarchies and status reveals another area of cognitive distortion. He doesn't seem to accurately assess where he fits in social structures. Sometimes he acts as if he's more important or powerful than he actually is. Other times he defers to authority inappropriately. His framework for understanding who has power and how social systems work appears inconsistent and often wrong. In the episode E Peterbus Unum from Season 2, Peter declares his property an independent nation. His framework tells him this is a reasonable action that will work. He doesn't understand the legal and political realities that make his plan impossible. The way Peter frames gender roles and family dynamics also shows unusual patterns. His understanding of what husbands and fathers should do seems drawn from outdated models or simply made up. In the episode I Am Peter, Hear Me Roar from Season 2, Peter attends a women's retreat and temporarily adopts what he thinks is a feminine perspective. His framework for understanding gender is so rigid and stereotype-based that when it shifts, his entire personality changes. He cannot hold a nuanced view where people have both masculine and feminine qualities. His framework forces everything into extreme categories. Peter's economic reasoning reveals cognitive frameworks that don't match how money actually works. He doesn't understand budgets, savings, or financial planning. When he has money, his framework tells him to spend it immediately on whatever he wants. When he doesn't have money, he doesn't connect that to his spending patterns. In the episode Death Has a Shadow from Season 1, Peter receives a large check from a government program and immediately spends it on ridiculous purchases. His framework for understanding money doesn't include concepts like saving for future needs or spending responsibly. The show exploits Peter's cognitive distortions to comment on broader social issues through exaggeration. By showing Peter's completely warped interpretations, the writers can highlight how certain types of thinking are problematic. When Peter's framework produces obviously wrong conclusions, viewers can recognize similar but less extreme errors in real reasoning. The comedy serves a social commentary function by making cognitive distortions visible and absurd. In the episode Patriot Games from Season 4, Peter becomes a professional football player, and his framework for understanding competition and sportsmanship produces increasingly violent behavior. He interprets the game through a lens of personal vendetta rather than athletic competition. His cognitive framework turns what should be contained athletic rivalry into genuine hatred and desire to harm. This distortion shows how framing effects can transform the meaning and emotional weight of situations. Peter's religious and spiritual frameworks appear inconsistent and superficial throughout the series. In some episodes, he expresses belief in God and Christian teachings. In others, he seems to have no religious framework at all. In The Father, the Son, and the Holy Fawns from Season 4, Peter converts to a religion based on the TV character Fonzie. His framework for understanding spirituality is so shallow that he can adopt a new religion based on a sitcom character without seeing any problem with this. His cognitive structures for dealing with ultimate questions and meaning are either absent or completely dysfunctional. The way Peter frames his own past and personal narrative shows interesting patterns. He tells stories about his life that contradict other stories he's told. He remembers events differently each time he discusses them. His framework for constructing autobiographical memory appears unstable. In flashback episodes that show Peter's younger years, we see events that Peter later references completely differently. His mind doesn't maintain a coherent narrative of his own life story. Each telling reconstructs events to fit his current framework, rather than accurately representing what happened. Peter's framework for understanding friendship and loyalty shows both positive and negative distortions. He values his friendships with Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland highly and shows loyalty to them in certain situations. His framework for what friends should do for each other appears to be based more on shared activities than emotional support. In the episode Jerome is the New Black from Season 8, when Cleveland moves away and is replaced by a new neighbor, Peter's framework allows him to immediately transfer his friendship to the new person. The framework is about filling a social role rather than valuing the specific individual. Peter's cognitive framework for processing new information appears rigid and resistant to updating. When he learns something that contradicts his existing beliefs, he tends to dismiss the new information rather than adjust his framework. This resistance to cognitive updating means Peter doesn't learn from experience in normal ways. His frameworks remain stable even when reality repeatedly demonstrates they're wrong. In the episode Petarded from Season 4, even after learning his IQ is low, Peter's framework for understanding his own intelligence doesn't really change in lasting ways. He continues to approach problems with the same overconfidence. The show's writers use Peter's distorted cognitive framing to create specific types of humor. There's the humor of watching someone completely misunderstand a situation. There's the humor of seeing someone confident despite being obviously wrong. There's the humor that comes from the gap between Peter's interpretation and viewer knowledge. These different humor mechanisms all depend on Peter's cognitive frameworks producing interpretations that diverge from reality in predictable ways. Peter's framework for understanding cause and effect in relationships shows particular dysfunction. When Lois is upset with him, he often cannot identify what he did wrong. His framework doesn't connect his actions to her emotional responses. He interprets her anger as irrational or random, rather than as a consequence of his behavior. In the episode The Story on Page 1 from Season 2, Peter cannot understand why Lois is upset about the article he wrote about her. His framework tells him the article was good, so her reaction makes no sense to him. The relationship between Peter's cognitive framing and his lack of self-awareness becomes clear through these patterns. His frameworks for understanding the world don't include accurate models of himself. He cannot step outside his own perspective to see how his interpretations might be wrong. This creates a closed system, where his frameworks interpret everything, including evidence that the frameworks are faulty, in ways that confirm the frameworks. Peter is trapped inside his own distorted cognitive structures, with no mechanism for recognizing or escaping that distortion. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Peter's warped way of seeing the world doesn't exist in isolation because the environment of Quahog and the people around him play a crucial role in maintaining and reinforcing these dysfunctional patterns. Section 8. Safety, Environment, and Reinforcement in Quahog. How the world shapes him. Peter Griffin's psychological patterns and behavioral problems don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped, maintained, and reinforced by the social environment of Quahog, Rhode Island. Understanding Peter's psychology requires examining the community context in which he lives. The town of Quahog, its residents, its institutions, and its social norms all play crucial roles in either enabling Peter's dysfunction or failing to provide the corrective feedback that might help him develop healthier patterns. The environment essentially teaches Peter that his behavior is acceptable through consistent reinforcement of his dysfunctional choices. Quahog is portrayed throughout the series as a town filled with bizarre, dysfunctional, and often criminal residents. Peter's neighbors and community members engage in behavior that ranges from merely odd to genuinely dangerous and illegal. In this context, Peter's own dysfunction doesn't stand out as particularly unusual or problematic. He's surrounded by people whose behavior is equally or more disturbed than his own. This normalization effect means Peter receives no environmental feedback suggesting his behavior is abnormal or needs to change. The concept of social norms is crucial for understanding how environments shape behavior. Social norms are the unwritten rules about acceptable behavior in a particular community. People learn these norms through observation and through consequences they experience when violating norms. In most communities, Peter's behavior would violate numerous social norms, and he would face negative consequences like social rejection, legal penalties, or loss of employment. In Quahog, the social norms themselves appear dysfunctional. The community tolerates and even reinforces behavior that would be unacceptable elsewhere. Peter's neighbor Glenn Quagmire provides a clear example of how Quahog's environment normalizes dysfunction. Quagmire is portrayed as a sexual predator, whose behavior toward women is criminal and disturbing. He openly discusses illegal activities and shows no remorse for harmful behavior. In a functional community, someone like Quagmire would face legal consequences and social ostracism. In Quahog, he's accepted as a normal member of the community. He maintains friendships, holds a job as a pilot, and faces no meaningful consequences for his behavior. This environmental tolerance tells Peter and other residents that extreme dysfunction is acceptable. Peter's other neighbor, Joe Swanson, is a police officer, which should represent law enforcement and social control. Joe's policing in Quahog is inconsistent and often ineffective. He witnesses illegal behavior from his friends, including Peter, and rarely takes official action. When Joe does attempt to enforce laws, he's portrayed as overzealous or inappropriate. The show suggests that even the institutions meant to maintain social order in Quahog are dysfunctional. This environmental failure means Peter faces few consequences for behavior that should result in arrest or legal penalties. The episode E Peter Bus Unum from Season 2 shows Peter declaring his property an independent nation. This action should bring immediate response from government authorities. Instead, the episode treats it as a minor nuisance that eventually gets resolved through absurd means rather than normal legal processes. The environment of Quahog doesn't provide the reality-based feedback that would help Peter understand the limits of acceptable behavior. His grandiose and unrealistic plans meet with resistance that's either absent or comes in forms that don't teach useful lessons. Peter's workplace environment also reinforces rather than corrects his dysfunction. At the Pawtucket Brewery where Peter works, he's shown engaging in behavior that should result in immediate termination. He drinks on the job, he ignores safety protocols, he's insubordinate to supervisors, he causes accidents and damages property. Despite all this, Peter maintains employment, with only occasional firings that are quickly reversed. In the episode Death Has a Shadow from Season 1, Peter gets fired for being drunk at work, but relatively quickly gets his job back. The workplace environment teaches Peter that even serious violations of employment norms have temporary and reversible consequences. The broader Quahog community includes numerous characters who enable and reinforce Peter's behavior through their own dysfunction. Mayor Adam West is portrayed as mentally unstable and incompetent. Tom Tucker and other local media figures are shown as ethically compromised. Business owners engage in illegal or dangerous practices. The town lacks functional leadership or institutions that might provide structure and consequences for inappropriate behavior. This institutional failure creates an environment where Peter's personal dysfunction is met with environmental dysfunction rather than with corrective feedback. The physical environment of Quahog also plays a role. The Drunken Clam Bar is always open and always welcoming to Peter and his friends. This easy access to alcohol and to a social environment centered on drinking makes it simple for Peter to maintain his substance use patterns. If the bar were farther away, had limited hours, or was less welcoming, Peter might face more barriers to constant drinking. Instead, the environment makes drinking the path of least resistance. The physical structure of Peter's social world reinforces the behaviors that cause him problems. Peter's family environment shows a similar pattern of dysfunction and enabling. Lois occasionally objects to Peter's behavior, but rarely enforces meaningful consequences. She cleans up his messes, makes excuses for him, and ultimately allows him to continue patterns that harm the family. In the episode Let's Go to the Hop from Season 2, when Peter's behavior becomes particularly problematic, Lois expresses frustration but doesn't take actions that would force Peter to change. The home environment provides complaints but not consequences, teaching Peter that he can continue misbehaving as long as he weathers some verbal criticism. The show portrays Quahog's institutions as universally dysfunctional. The schools are terrible, the hospital is dangerous, the police are ineffective, the government is corrupt, the media is sensationalistic, the religious institutions are hypocritical. This complete institutional failure means that Peter lives in an environment with no functional structures that could provide guidance, support, or appropriate consequences. Every system that might help a person develop better functioning is itself broken in ways that reinforce dysfunction instead. The episode The Courtship of Stewie's Father from Season 4 shows Peter joining a children's group and interacting with other parents. Even in this context where you might expect more functional social norms around parenting and appropriate behavior, the other parents engage in their own bizarre and dysfunctional patterns. Peter's inappropriate parenting doesn't stand out. The environment provides no models of healthy functioning that Peter could observe and learn from. Everyone around him is equally or more dysfunctional, so there's no opportunity for social learning that would improve his behavior. Quahog's response to violence and danger also reinforces Peter's risky behavior. The town experiences constant chaos, destruction, and violence. Buildings explode, cars crash, people get hurt, and the community simply rebuilds and continues. There are no lasting consequences for actions that cause widespread damage. In the episode Lethal Weapons from Season 3, Peter and Lois have a physical fight that causes significant property damage. The community's response is minimal. The environment teaches that even destructive violence can happen without serious repercussions. The social feedback loops in Quahog operate in ways that maintain dysfunction rather than correcting it. When Peter does something outrageous, his friends often encourage or admire the behavior rather than challenging it. When he succeeds at something through luck or accident, people treat it as if his approach was sensible. When he fails, the consequences are either absent or so absurd that they don't provide useful learning. The feedback Peter receives from his environment doesn't help him distinguish between functional and dysfunctional behavior patterns. Peter's extended family also represents dysfunctional environmental influences. Lois's father, Carter Peterschmidt, is wealthy but cruel and manipulative. Lois's mother, Barbara, is submissive and enabling. Peter's own father, Francis, was abusive and critical. The family models Peter has been exposed to throughout his life all demonstrated various forms of dysfunction. He has no examples of healthy family relationships or functional parenting to draw from. The environmental inputs that shaped Peter's development were themselves problematic. The episode The Griffin Family History from Season 4 shows flashbacks to Peter's ancestors, suggesting that dysfunction runs through his family line across generations. This environmental history means Peter inherited not just genetic vulnerabilities, but also family patterns of behavior that were dysfunctional. The intergenerational transmission of dysfunction occurs through environmental learning as much as through biology. Peter learned dysfunctional patterns from his parents, who learned them from their parents, creating a multi-generational environmental influence. Quahog's tolerance for Peter's behavior also relates to class and social position. Peter is working class, white, and male. The environment appears to grant him more leeway for dysfunction than it might grant to people with different demographic characteristics. When Peter gets in trouble with authorities, he often escapes serious consequences through luck or through privileges associated with his social position. The environment's response to his behavior is filtered through social hierarchies that protect him from accountability. The media environment in Quahog also reinforces dysfunction. Television shows within the Family Guy universe are portrayed as stupid, violent, or otherwise problematic. Peter consumes this media constantly, and it shapes his understanding of how the world works. In the episode I Never Met the Dead Man from Season 1, Peter's television obsession shapes his entire worldview. The media environment provides models of behavior and frameworks for understanding reality that are themselves dysfunctional. Peter learns from television how to interpret situations and how to behave, and what he learns reinforces his problems. The economic environment of Quahog also plays a role. Peter maintains employment and apparently earns enough to support his family, despite his dysfunction. If the economic environment were less forgiving, if jobs were harder to keep or money were tighter, Peter might face more pressure to function better. Instead, the economic structure of his world allows him to be irresponsible without facing financial ruin. In the episode Death Has a Shadow from Season 1, even after Peter loses his job, he accidentally gets welfare money that temporarily solves the financial problem. The economic environment cushions the consequences of his poor choices. The peer reinforcement Peter receives from his friend group is particularly powerful in maintaining his behavioral patterns. Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland not only fail to challenge Peter's dysfunction, but actively participate in and encourage his schemes. In the episode Ocean's 3.5 from Season 7, Peter's friends help him plan and execute a bank robbery. The peer environment doesn't provide the kind of supportive confrontation that might help Peter recognize and change problematic patterns. Instead, peers validate and amplify his dysfunction. The physical safety of Quahog is also relevant. Despite constant violence, accidents, and chaos, people rarely suffer lasting harm. Peter himself has been injured countless times in ways that should be fatal or permanently disabling, yet he always recovers fully. The environment teaches that physical danger doesn't have real consequences. This removes one of the natural feedback mechanisms that would normally encourage more cautious behavior. Without real physical consequences for risky choices, Peter has no environmental reason to be more careful. The cultural environment of Quahog lacks the kind of pro-social institutions and activities that might provide alternative frameworks for behavior. There are no thriving community organizations teaching positive values. There are no strong religious communities promoting ethical behavior. There are no cultural institutions like museums or theaters that might expose residents to different perspectives. The cultural poverty of the environment means Peter has limited exposure to ideas and values that might challenge his dysfunctional patterns. Quahog's response to mental health and addiction also reinforces Peter's problems. Mental health services appear absent or ineffective. Substance abuse is normalized, rather than treated as a health issue requiring intervention. When Peter briefly attends AA meetings in Friends of Peter G., he returns to drinking partly because the broader environment provides no support for sobriety. The lack of mental health infrastructure in Quahog means Peter's psychological problems go unaddressed, and his coping mechanisms, however dysfunctional, continue unchallenged. The environmental reinforcement Peter receives isn't always obvious or direct. Sometimes it's simply the absence of consequences. Sometimes it's other people modeling similar dysfunction. Sometimes it's institutions failing to provide structure and limits. The cumulative effect of all these environmental factors is to create a context where Peter's dysfunction is maintained and reinforced rather than corrected. He lives in an environment perfectly designed to keep him exactly as dysfunctional as he is. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These environmental patterns help explain how Peter's dysfunction persists, and when we examine all these observable patterns together, we can start to carefully consider what diagnostic features a psychologist might note if Peter were a real person. Section 9. Possible Diagnostic Observations. A Psychologist's Perspective. Without labels. After examining Peter Griffin's behavioral patterns, cognitive functioning, emotional regulation, social interactions, and environmental context across the previous sections, we can carefully consider what observable features a psychologist might note if Peter were a real person sitting in their office. This discussion is not a clinical diagnosis. Peter is a fictional character created for comedy, and attempting to diagnose cartoon characters as if they were real patients would be inappropriate and meaningless. However, we can observe that Peter's consistent patterns of behavior align with certain psychological concepts that help us understand his character more deeply. The most prominent observable pattern in Peter's behavior involves severe impulsivity and difficulty controlling his actions. A psychologist observing Peter would note that he acts on urges immediately, without pausing to consider consequences. He makes major life decisions in seconds. He speaks without filtering his thoughts. He engages in risky behavior without apparent concern for safety. This pattern of impulsive action without consideration of outcomes appears across every domain of his life. In clinical settings, when impulsivity is this severe and pervasive, it suggests problems with brain systems that normally help people pause between urge and action. Peter's attention patterns would also catch a psychologist's notice. He has difficulty maintaining focus on tasks that don't provide immediate stimulation. He gets distracted easily and shifts from one activity to another without completing what he started. In the episode Let's Go to the Hop from Season 2, Peter starts an undercover investigation at his son's school, but constantly gets sidetracked by other interests and activities. His attention jumps around rather than staying fixed on goals. When someone cannot sustain attention on tasks or follow through with plans, It suggests difficulties with the brain systems that regulate focus and goal-directed behavior. The combination of severe impulsivity and attention problems, when observed together, creates a recognizable pattern. A psychologist might note that these features appear consistent with attention regulation difficulties. Peter shows the kind of behavioral pattern where impulses dominate action, where attention shifts constantly, and where hyperactive behavior appears across many situations. The episode Airport 07 from Season 7 shows Peter on an airplane where he impulsively empties the plane's fuel, causing a crash. This action demonstrates both the inability to resist impulses and the failure to consider obvious consequences that characterize severe impulse control problems. Peter's emotional patterns would also be notable to any observing psychologist. His emotions shift rapidly and intensely. He goes from happy to enraged in seconds. His emotional reactions often seem disproportionate to the triggering events. He has difficulty calming himself down once upset. He cannot seem to use cognitive strategies to manage his feelings. These patterns suggest problems with emotional regulation systems in the brain. When someone's emotions are this volatile and difficult to control, it indicates that the neural circuits responsible for modulating emotional responses are not functioning effectively. A psychologist would also observe Peter's aggressive tendencies as a concerning pattern. He responds to conflict with physical violence. He holds grudges and seeks revenge for minor slights. His ongoing fights with the giant chicken across multiple episodes demonstrate sustained aggression that goes far beyond normal frustration or anger. In the episode Blind Ambition from Season 4, one of these chicken fights causes massive destruction and both characters suffer serious injuries. The willingness to engage in this level of violence repeatedly suggests that Peter's aggression threshold is severely impaired. The relationship between Peter's substance use and his other difficulties would not escape a psychologist's attention. Peter drinks alcohol daily and in large quantities. His drinking interferes with his work, family responsibilities, and safety. He continues drinking despite obvious negative consequences. He shows signs of tolerance, needing to drink more to feel effects. When he briefly tried to stop drinking in Friends of Peter G from Season 9, he experienced discomfort and quickly returned to his usual pattern. These observable features align with patterns seen in alcohol use disorders, where drinking becomes compulsive and continues despite harm. Peter's cognitive functioning would raise additional concerns for an observing psychologist. His performance on the IQ test in Petarded from Season 4 revealed significantly below average intelligence. Beyond the test score, Peter demonstrates concrete thinking, difficulty with abstract concepts, poor problem-solving abilities, and limited verbal skills. A psychologist might note that Peter's cognitive abilities appear genuinely impaired across multiple domains. This kind of general cognitive impairment affects someone's capacity to learn from experience, plan for the future, and make sound decisions. The executive function deficits we discussed in earlier sections would be very apparent to a psychologist conducting an evaluation. Peter cannot plan effectively. He struggles with working memory. He shows cognitive inflexibility and perseveration. He cannot inhibit inappropriate responses. He fails to learn from mistakes. These executive function problems all point to difficulties with the frontal lobes of the brain, the regions responsible for higher-order thinking and behavioral control. A psychologist would likely recommend neuropsychological testing to better understand the extent and nature of Peter's cognitive impairments. Peter's social cognition problems would also be observable and concerning. He misreads social cues. He cannot accurately interpret other people's emotions or intentions. He violates social norms without recognizing he's doing so. He struggles to maintain appropriate boundaries in relationships. In the episode The Courtship of Stewie's Father from Season 4, Peter joins a children's group and his interactions with other parents are consistently awkward because he misses social signals and behaves inappropriately. These difficulties suggest impairment in the brain systems that process social information. A psychologist would note Peter's complete lack of insight into his own problems. He doesn't recognize his behavioral patterns. He cannot identify his deficits or understand how his actions affect others. He shows no awareness that his thinking might be flawed. This absence of metacognitive awareness is itself a significant clinical feature. When someone cannot observe their own mental processes or recognize their limitations, it makes treatment and behavior change extremely difficult. Peter's lack of insight appears total and consistent across all episodes. The environmental and developmental factors in Peter's history would be relevant to a psychological evaluation. His father, Francis, was emotionally abusive and critical, as shown in episodes like The Father, the Son, and the Holy Fawns from Season 4. Peter experienced childhood trauma and neglect that would have affected his emotional development. He has sustained numerous head injuries throughout his life that would have caused cumulative brain damage. He has used alcohol heavily for years, which causes progressive neurological impairment. All of these factors help explain the severity of Peter's current difficulties. A psychologist evaluating Peter would likely consider multiple possible explanations for his presentation. The traumatic brain injuries alone could account for many of his symptoms. Repeated concussions and head trauma damage the frontal lobes and cause problems with impulse control, emotional regulation, judgment, and personality. The chronic alcohol use could explain cognitive decline, emotional instability, and behavioral disinhibition. The childhood trauma and poor attachment with caregivers could account for his relationship difficulties and emotional dysregulation. However, a careful psychologist would note that Peter's problems likely involve multiple contributing factors rather than a single cause. The brain injuries, the alcohol use, the developmental trauma, and possible underlying neurodevelopmental conditions all interact and compound each other. Someone with attention and impulse control problems is more likely to engage in risky behavior that leads to head injuries. Someone with head injuries is more likely to develop substance use problems. Someone with substance use problems experiences progressive brain damage that worsens cognitive and emotional functioning. The various factors create a downward spiral of worsening impairment. The pattern of Peter's difficulties also raises questions about neurodevelopmental factors that might have been present from childhood. The combination of attention problems, impulsivity, hyperactivity, and learning difficulties could suggest underlying neurodevelopmental conditions that were never diagnosed or treated. In the episode Petarded, we learn that Peter has always struggled academically and cognitively. These lifelong patterns suggest problems that began in childhood and persisted into adulthood, becoming worse over time as additional factors like substance use and brain injuries accumulated. A psychologist might observe that Peter shows signs of personality pathology in addition to his cognitive and behavioral problems. His narcissistic traits, his lack of empathy, his exploitation of others, and his inability to maintain stable relationships all suggest personality-level dysfunction. The way Peter treats his daughter Meg, consistently cruel and dismissive across hundreds of episodes, demonstrates a pattern of behavior that goes beyond occasional poor judgment. It suggests a stable personality feature where Peter cannot recognize or respond to his child's emotional needs. The observation that Peter's problems are pervasive across all life domains would be clinically significant. He has difficulties at work, at home, in friendships, in his marriage, with his children, with strangers, and in every social context. The problems appear in the morning and at night, when sober and when drunk, in familiar situations and novel ones. This pervasiveness suggests that whatever is wrong with Peter represents core features of how his brain functions, rather than situation-specific difficulties. A psychologist would note that treatment would need to address fundamental issues with cognition, emotion regulation, and behavioral control. A psychologist conducting a thorough evaluation would also assess Peter's strengths and protective factors. Despite all his problems, Peter maintains employment most of the time. He has long-term friendships that have persisted for years. His marriage to Lois, while troubled, has survived. He shows moments of genuine affection for his family. These strengths suggest that Peter has some capacity for relationship, some ability to function in structured environments, and some emotional resources that could potentially be built upon in treatment. Understanding someone's strengths is as important as cataloging their deficits. The question of Peter's capacity for change would be central to any psychological evaluation. Can someone with this level of impairment improve with treatment? Peter's lack of insight makes traditional talk therapy unlikely to help. His cognitive limitations would make it difficult for him to learn and apply new behavioral strategies. His impulsivity would interfere with following through on treatment plans. His substance use would need to be addressed before other interventions could be effective. A realistic psychologist would recognize that Peter's prognosis for significant improvement is poor without intensive, multimodal intervention. However, the psychologist might note that certain interventions could potentially help even someone with Peter's level of impairment. Medication to address impulsivity and attention problems might reduce some of his most dangerous behaviors. Structured behavioral programs with immediate consequences could help shape better habits even without requiring insight. Treatment for alcohol use disorder could prevent further brain damage and might allow some cognitive recovery. Family therapy could help Lois and the children develop strategies for managing Peter's behavior and protecting themselves from its effects. A psychologist would also need to consider questions of capacity and safety. Can Peter make informed decisions about his own treatment? Does he have the cognitive ability to understand his problems and consent to interventions? Is he a danger to himself or others? The repeated instances of Peter engaging in behavior that endangers himself, his family, and the community would raise serious safety concerns. In the episode I Never Met the Dead Man from Season 1, Peter's behavior causes a town-wide power outage. In Airport 07, his actions crash an airplane. These incidents suggest that Peter's impaired judgment creates genuine risk. The environmental factors maintaining Peter's dysfunction would also be part of a comprehensive psychological evaluation. A psychologist would note that Peter lives in Quahog, a community that enables and reinforces his problematic behavior. His friends drink heavily with him. His wife, while occasionally objecting, ultimately accepts his behavior. His workplace tolerates dysfunction. The lack of environmental consequences allows Peter to continue patterns that would be unsustainable in a more structured, less forgiving setting. Effective treatment would need to address these environmental factors in addition to Peter's individual issues. A psychologist reviewing all these observations might conclude that Peter represents a complex case involving multiple intersecting problems. The cognitive impairment, the substance use disorder, the emotional dysregulation, the behavioral problems, the personality issues, and the environmental factors all contribute to his current functioning. No single diagnosis would capture the full picture. Peter would likely receive multiple diagnoses reflecting the various domains of dysfunction. The treatment plan would need to be comprehensive, addressing cognitive rehabilitation, substance abuse treatment, medication management, behavioral intervention, and environmental modification. The most important observation a psychologist might make is that Peter's level of impairment significantly affects his quality of life and his family's well-being. Despite the comedic framing, Peter's life is chaotic. His relationships are troubled, and he causes harm to himself and others regularly. From a clinical perspective, this represents someone who needs help but lacks the insight to seek it, and lives in an environment that doesn't push him toward treatment. Understanding Peter through a psychological lens helps us see past the comedy to recognize the human cost of this level of dysfunction. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These clinical observations might seem heavy for a comedy character, but they actually serve a purpose in how the show functions as social commentary about modern life and responsibility. Section 10. Comedy as social commentary. What Peter says about real life. Peter Griffin's exaggerated psychological traits and dysfunctional behaviors serve a purpose beyond just making audiences laugh. Family Guy uses Peter as a vehicle for social commentary, employing comedy to examine and critique various aspects of American culture, family dynamics, work life, and social responsibility. Understanding how Peter's character functions as commentary helps explain why the show presents him with such extreme dysfunction, and why audiences find entertainment in watching someone whose real-life equivalent would be deeply troubled and troubling. The tradition of using comedy to comment on society goes back thousands of years. Satirists have always employed exaggeration and absurdity to highlight problems in their cultures. By making something ridiculous, comedy can make us see it more clearly. Family Guy operates in this tradition, using Peter's behavior to shine a light on issues in contemporary American life. Peter represents an extreme version of certain tendencies that exist in milder forms throughout society. The comedy amplifies these tendencies until they become impossible to ignore. Peter's irresponsibility as a father serves as commentary on American parenting culture. In the episode Death Has a Shadow from Season 1, Peter loses his job and hides this fact from his family rather than dealing with the problem directly. This behavior exaggerates a tendency some parents have to avoid difficult conversations or to prioritize their own comfort over their family's needs. The show takes this common avoidance pattern and pushes it to absurd extremes. By showing Peter behaving outrageously irresponsibly, the comedy invites viewers to reflect on smaller ways they might avoid parental responsibility in their own lives. The way Peter treats his daughter Meg throughout the series functions as dark commentary on family scapegoating and the psychological abuse that can happen in households. Every family has dynamics where certain members receive more criticism or less support. Family Guy takes this pattern and exaggerates it to the point where Meg is openly despised and abused by her entire family. The comedy is uncomfortable because it touches on real family dysfunction. In the episode Seahorse Seashell Party from season 10, Meg confronts the family about their treatment of her, making the commentary explicit. The show is saying something about how families sometimes need one member to be the target of negative emotions. Peter's relationship with work and authority provides commentary on American attitudes toward employment and class. Peter works a blue-collar job at a brewery and shows little respect for his employers or workplace rules. He drinks on the job, ignores safety protocols, and treats his employment as something he deserves rather than something he must earn through performance. This exaggerates attitudes that exist in milder forms across many workplaces. In the episode The Story on Page 1 from season 2, Peter quits his job impulsively when criticized, highlighting how ego and wounded pride sometimes matter more to people than practical concerns like paying bills. The show uses Peter's substance abuse as commentary on American drinking culture. The normalization of Peter's heavy drinking, the way his friends enable it, and how his family tolerates it all reflect real patterns in how American society deals with alcohol. We treat some forms of substance use as acceptable social behavior, while condemning others. In the episode Friends of Peter G from season 9, when Peter briefly confronts his drinking problem, the show comments on how difficult it is to change behavior when your entire social world is built around substance use. The comedy highlights the uncomfortable truth that changing individual behavior often requires changing entire social networks. Peter's impulsivity and poor decision-making serve as commentary on American culture's emphasis on following your desires and doing what feels good. The broader culture sends messages about authenticity, being true to yourself, and not letting others constrain you. Peter takes these messages to their logical extreme. He always does what he wants, never constrains himself, and follows every impulse. The result is chaos and harm. The comedy suggests that the cultural messages about individual freedom and self-expression, when taken too far, lead to Peter-level dysfunction. The episode I Am Peter, Hear Me Roar from season 2 uses Peter's experience at a women's retreat to comment on gender roles and feminism. The show takes stereotypes about masculinity and femininity and exaggerates them through Peter's character. When Peter temporarily adopts feminine behaviors, the comedy comes from seeing rigid gender categories broken down. The social commentary involves questioning what masculine and feminine even mean, and whether these categories help or harm people. The exaggeration makes visible the arbitrary nature of many gender expectations. Peter's narcissism and lack of empathy reflect commentary on American individualism taken to extremes. The culture emphasizes individual achievement, personal freedom, and self-interest. Peter embodies these values completely. He considers his own wants and needs above everyone else's. He cannot see from other perspectives. He treats other people as obstacles or tools rather than as individuals with their own worth. The comedy suggests that American individualism, when pushed to its limits, produces people who cannot function in community or maintain relationships. The way Quahog as a community enables Peter's dysfunction serves as commentary on American society's failure to address mental health, addiction, and behavioral problems. The town has no effective institutions, no mental health services, no real consequences for harmful behavior. In the episode E Peterbus Unum from season 2, when Peter declares his property an independent nation, the government's response is ineffective and absurd. This reflects real frustrations with institutional incompetence and the feeling that systems meant to maintain social order often fail in their basic functions. Peter's political engagement, when it occurs in various episodes, provides commentary on American political culture. He makes decisions based on superficial factors. He doesn't understand policy or how government works. He's easily swayed by rhetoric and personality rather than substance. In episodes dealing with elections or political issues, Peter represents the low-information voter who participates in democracy without the knowledge or critical thinking needed to make informed choices. The comedy highlights anxieties about whether democratic systems can function when many participants lack basic civic knowledge. The show's use of cutaway gags and random humor through Peter's associations serves as commentary on modern attention spans and media consumption. Peter's mind jumps constantly from topic to topic, making bizarre connections and losing focus on whatever he was originally doing. This mirrors how contemporary media, especially internet culture, encourages rapid attention shifting and privileges novelty over depth. The episode I Never Met the Dead Man from Season 1, where Peter becomes obsessed with television, comments directly on how media consumption shapes consciousness and behavior. Peter's treatment of his body and health provides commentary on American attitudes toward diet, exercise, and medical care. He eats poorly, drinks heavily, ignores obvious health problems, and only seeks medical care when forced to by crisis. In the episode Mixed Stroke from Season 6, Peter's obsessive eating at a fast food restaurant leads to a stroke. The comedy exaggerates patterns of health neglect that contribute to America's obesity epidemic and chronic disease burden. The show comments on how immediate gratification consistently wins over long-term health considerations. The financial irresponsibility Peter shows throughout the series reflects commentary on American consumer culture and debt. Peter spends money he doesn't have on things he doesn't need. He makes no plans for the future. He lives entirely in the present moment. In the episode Death Has a Shadow, when Peter receives a large check, he immediately spends it on ridiculous purchases rather than paying bills or saving. This exaggerates tendencies toward consumption and instant gratification that drive much of American economic behavior and contribute to widespread financial insecurity. Peter's friendships with Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland comment on male relationships and emotional intimacy in American culture. The men spend hours together but never discuss feelings or provide real emotional support. Their friendship is based on shared activities, particularly drinking, rather than genuine vulnerability or mutual care. In the episode Jerome is the New Black from Season 8, when Cleveland moves away, the group immediately replaces him with a new person, suggesting the relationships are about filling social roles rather than valuing specific individuals. The comedy highlights how men often struggle to form deep emotional connections. The show uses Peter's lack of self-awareness as commentary on American culture's resistance to self-reflection and growth. The emphasis on self-esteem and positive thinking sometimes prevents people from honestly examining their flaws or taking responsibility for problems. Peter shows this pattern in extreme form. He never questions himself or admits fault. He always externalizes blame. In the episode Petarded from Season 4, even after learning his IQ is low, Peter doesn't engage in genuine self-reflection. The comedy suggests that American culture's focus on feeling good about yourself can prevent the kind of honest self-assessment needed for growth. Peter's interactions with his extended family provide commentary on class divisions in America. Lois comes from a wealthy family, while Peter is working class. Her parents look down on Peter and treat him with contempt. Peter resents their wealth and status. These dynamics play out across multiple episodes, highlighting how class shapes family relationships and how economic inequality creates social divisions that persist even in intimate relationships. The comedy examines how money and class background affect everything from self-worth to family acceptance. The environmental destruction and chaos that follow Peter wherever he goes serve as commentary on individual impact and collective responsibility. Peter causes massive damage through his thoughtless actions, but rarely faces consequences. In the episode Airport 07 from Season 7, his behavior crashes an airplane. In I Never Met the Dead Man, he causes a town-wide power outage. The comedy exaggerates how individual actions can have large-scale consequences, and how societies struggle to hold people accountable for the harm they cause, especially when that harm is indirect or unintentional. Peter's religious views, shown inconsistently across episodes, provide commentary on American religious culture. In The Father, the Son, and the Holy Fawns from Season 4, Peter converts to a religion based on a TV character, highlighting how American spirituality sometimes lacks depth and treats religion as consumer choice rather than serious commitment. The comedy examines how people pick and choose religious beliefs based on convenience rather than conviction, and how religious identity often functions as social signaling rather than genuine faith. The way Peter responds to authority throughout the series comments on American attitudes toward rules and institutions. He respects no authority figures. He follows no rules he doesn't personally agree with. He believes his individual judgment supersedes expert knowledge, legal requirements, and social norms. This exaggerates a strain of American thinking that privileges individual opinion over collective expertise and treats rules as suggestions rather than requirements. The comedy shows where this attitude leads when taken to its logical conclusion. Peter's role as protagonist, despite his severe dysfunction, serves as meta-commentary on media and entertainment. The show centers someone who would be a villain or cautionary tale in a more traditional narrative. By making Peter the character we follow, and sometimes root for, Family Guy comments on how media shapes our sympathies and how comedy can make us laugh at things that should disturb us. The structure itself provides commentary on how entertainment works and what it does to our moral intuitions. The exaggeration inherent in Peter's character is what makes the social commentary effective. If Peter were only mildly dysfunctional, viewers might not recognize the patterns being highlighted. By pushing everything to absurd extremes, the show makes visible tendencies that exist in milder forms throughout society. When we laugh at Peter, we're partly laughing at seeing our own smaller dysfunctions magnified to ridiculous proportions. The comedy works because the exaggeration illuminates truth rather than obscuring it. Family Guy uses Peter to hold up a mirror to American culture, showing us what our values and behaviors look like when taken to their logical extremes. The alcoholism comments on drinking culture. The irresponsibility comments on individualism. The poor parenting comments on family dysfunction. The ignorance comments on anti-intellectualism. The impulsivity comments on instant gratification. Every aspect of Peter's dysfunction connects to broader social patterns that the show invites us to examine through the lens of comedy. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But beyond serving as social commentary, Peter's extreme flaws also create a kind of relatability that helps explain why audiences connect with him despite his obvious problems. Section 11. Relatability and why viewers connect. Why we laugh and care. Peter Griffin is objectively a terrible person with severe psychological problems, yet millions of viewers have watched Family Guy for over 2 decades, and many feel genuine affection for his character. This paradox raises interesting questions about why audiences connect with deeply flawed characters, and what Peter's popularity reveals about viewer psychology. Understanding the appeal of Peter's character requires examining how exaggerated dysfunction can paradoxically create relatability, and how comedy transforms behaviors that would be repellent in real life into sources of entertainment and even identification. The most straightforward explanation for Peter's appeal is that he does and says things viewers wish they could do but cannot because of social constraints and consequences. Peter acts on every impulse without filtering or self-censoring. When he's angry at someone, he tells them directly or even attacks them physically. When he wants something, he takes it. When he's bored with a conversation, he walks away. This complete freedom from social inhibition is something many people fantasize about. Watching Peter operate without the normal constraints of politeness, consequence, or social judgment provides vicarious satisfaction. In the episode The Story on Page 1 from Season 2, Peter quits his job after his boss criticizes him. Most people have fantasized about telling off a difficult boss and walking out dramatically. Most people don't do this because they need their income and understand that burning bridges has long-term costs. Peter does it without hesitation. Watching him act out this fantasy allows viewers to experience the satisfaction of the dramatic exit without facing the real consequences. The comedy creates a safe space to enjoy rebellion against authority and social norms. Peter's incompetence also creates a kind of relatability through shared human imperfection. Everyone has felt stupid, made mistakes, failed at tasks that seem simple, or embarrassed themselves through ignorance or poor judgment. Peter experiences these feelings constantly and in exaggerated form. When Peter fails spectacularly at something in an episode, viewers recognize the basic experience of failure, even though the specific circumstances are absurd. In the episode The King is Dead from Season 2, Peter takes over directing a play and ruins it completely because he has no idea what he's doing. Anyone who has been in over their head at work or in a social situation can relate to that fundamental experience, even if they've never literally destroyed a theatrical production. The show also makes Peter sympathetic through moments of genuine emotion and vulnerability. Despite his many flaws, Peter clearly loves his family. He shows affection for Lois and expresses his feelings for her. He has moments of caring about his children. He values his friendships. These glimpses of authentic human connection remind viewers that underneath all the dysfunction, Peter has emotional needs and attachments just like everyone else. In the episode Death Lives from Season 3, Peter reflects on his relationship with Lois, and we see that his love for her is real, even if his behavior often fails to honor that love. Peter's childlike qualities contribute to his relatability as well. He approaches the world with a kind of naive wonder and enthusiasm that adults typically lose. He gets excited about simple pleasures. He pursues interests with total commitment and no self-consciousness. He doesn't worry about appearing foolish or immature. This childlike engagement with life appeals to the part of viewers that misses the unself-conscious joy of childhood. In the episode Chitty Chitty Death Bang from Season 1, Peter's excitement about planning Stewie's birthday party shows genuine enthusiasm that would be endearing if it weren't coupled with such poor judgment. The episodic nature of the show also affects how viewers relate to Peter. Each episode resets Peter's situation, erasing most consequences from previous episodes. This means viewers don't have to watch Peter's dysfunction accumulate into genuine tragedy. He never faces the real long-term cost of alcoholism, brain damage, or ruined relationships. The reset button allows audiences to enjoy Peter's chaos without confronting what this level of dysfunction would actually do to someone's life over time. We can laugh without feeling guilty because the show structure protects us from seeing real harm. Peter's lack of pretension makes him more likable than he might otherwise be. He's not trying to be sophisticated or intelligent. He doesn't put on airs or pretend to be better than he is. What you see is what you get. In a culture that often feels fake and performative, Peter's complete authenticity, even when that authenticity reveals terrible qualities, can feel refreshing. In the episode Petarded from Season 4, when Peter discovers his low IQ, he doesn't try to hide it or compensate for it. He simply is who he is. This radical authenticity, however problematic its content, appeals to viewers tired of social performance. The show's self-awareness about Peter's flaws also helps viewers maintain connection with his character. Family Guy doesn't pretend Peter is a good person or a role model. Other characters comment on his stupidity, selfishness, and destructive behavior. The show itself acknowledges through its structure and dialogue that Peter is dysfunctional. This honesty allows viewers to laugh at Peter, rather than being expected to admire or emulate him. In the episode Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10, Meg explicitly confronts Peter about his terrible parenting, and the show doesn't contradict her assessment. This acknowledgement of Peter's flaws paradoxically makes him easier to watch. Peter's failures also create a form of superiority-based entertainment. Viewers can watch Peter's incompetence and feel better about their own lives by comparison. No matter how badly someone's day went, they probably didn't crash an airplane or accidentally declare war on a neighboring country. This downward social comparison provides psychological comfort. Peter sets such a low bar that almost anyone watching can feel successful and competent relative to him. In the episode E Peterbus Unum from Season 2, Peter's attempt to create his own nation fails so spectacularly that viewers' own conflicts with authority seem minor by comparison. The universality of Peter's struggles, despite their exaggerated presentation, contributes to relatability. He struggles with his weight and body image. He has a complicated relationship with his father. He worries about money. He wants his friends to like him. He fears aging and irrelevance. He wants to be a good husband and father, but doesn't know how. These underlying concerns are deeply human and widely shared. The show wraps universal human struggles in absurd circumstances, but the emotional core remains recognizable. In the episode Mother Tucker from Season 5, Peter's grief over his mother's death is genuine, even though the specific events surrounding it are ridiculous. Peter's loyalty to his friends provides another point of connection. Despite his many flaws, Peter consistently shows up for Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland. He values these relationships and makes them a priority in his life. The friendships may be shallow in some ways, but they're also enduring and important to Peter. Many viewers can relate to having friendships that are maintained through shared activities rather than deep emotional disclosure. In the episode Jerome is the New Black from Season 8, Peter's jealousy when a new neighbor threatens his social position reveals how much these friendships matter to him. The show also uses Peter to explore male vulnerability and insecurity in ways that resonate with male viewers in particular. Peter is not the strong, silent, competent, masculine ideal. He's weak, scared, incompetent, and constantly unsure of himself despite his bravado. He cries. He fails. He needs help. He's emotionally dependent on his wife. This portrayal of masculine vulnerability, wrapped in comedy so it doesn't feel threatening, allows male viewers to see aspects of themselves that traditional masculine norms discourage acknowledging. In the episode Blind Ambition from Season 4, when Peter loses his sight temporarily, his vulnerability and need for care become central to the episode. Peter's relationship with Lois also creates relatability through the depiction of long-term marriage with all its complexity. They fight, they frustrate each other, they have different needs and wants. They also genuinely care about each other and keep choosing to stay together. Many viewers in long-term relationships recognize this mixture of love and irritation. In the episode The Kiss Scene Around the World from Season 3, Peter does something that upsets Lois. They have conflict, and they eventually reconcile. This cycle is familiar to anyone who has been in a relationship for years. The vicarious pleasure of watching Peter escape consequences also contributes to his appeal. In real life, actions have consequences that accumulate over time. Peter's world rarely works that way. He can do terrible things and be fine by the next episode. This fantasy of consequence-free living appeals to viewers who feel burdened by the weight of their own choices and their lasting effects. The show offers temporary escape into a world where you can mess up as badly as you want and still be okay. In the episode Airport 07 from Season 7, Peter causes a plane crash, but faces no lasting legal or personal consequences. Peter's moments of unexpected competence or success also create satisfaction for viewers. When someone who usually fails suddenly succeeds, it feels more rewarding than watching someone competent do well. The underdog appeal works for Peter. When he occasionally gets something right or wins against the odds, viewers feel happy for him because success seems less expected and therefore more valuable. In the episode Wasted Talent from Season 2, Peter discovers he can play piano beautifully when drunk, revealing hidden talent that surprises everyone, including himself. The show's use of Peter to mock political correctness and social constraints appeals to viewers who feel frustrated by increasing social rules about acceptable speech and behavior. Peter violates every social norm and says offensive things constantly. For viewers who feel that culture has become too sensitive or restrictive, watching Peter ignore all boundaries provides relief from perceived social pressure. This aspect of Peter's appeal is more controversial because it can attract viewers who enjoy the offensive content itself, rather than recognizing it as satire or social commentary. Peter's lack of character development across the series also contributes to his function as reliable entertainment. He doesn't learn or grow, which means viewers always know what they're getting. There's comfort in predictability. If Peter suddenly became responsible and functional, the show would lose much of what makes it distinctive. The static nature of Peter's character means the show can deliver the same type of humor consistently across hundreds of episodes. In any given episode, viewers can expect Peter to be impulsive, stupid, and inappropriate, and that reliability is part of the appeal. The physical comedy involving Peter's body also creates entertainment that transcends language and cultural barriers. Peter falls, crashes, gets hurt, and experiences physical slapstick that's funny, regardless of what language you speak or what culture you come from. His weight becomes part of the physical comedy, with Peter's body doing things that create visual humor. In the episode The Thin White Line from Season 3, physical comedy involving Peter provides humor that works even without understanding the dialogue. Peter's voice and manner of speaking, performed by Seth MacFarlane, add to his characterization in ways that increase relatability. The voice conveys vulnerability, confusion, enthusiasm, and hurt in ways that make Peter seem more human despite his cartoon nature. The vocal performance adds emotional layers that pure animation couldn't convey. MacFarlane's delivery can make Peter sound genuinely hurt, excited, or bewildered in ways that create empathy even when Peter's actions don't deserve it. The bond between Peter and Brian creates another avenue for viewer connection. Brian serves as audience surrogate in many episodes, reacting to Peter's behavior the way viewers might react. Brian is often exasperated by Peter, but also genuinely cares about him. Their friendship models how viewers relate to Peter, entertained and frustrated in equal measure, but ultimately attached to him. In the episode Road to Rhode Island from Season 2, the Peter and Brian dynamic shows genuine friendship beneath the dysfunction. Ultimately, Peter's relatability comes from the show's ability to find universal human experiences and emotions within utterly absurd circumstances. The specific situations Peter faces are ridiculous and exaggerated. The underlying feelings of inadequacy, desire for acceptance, fear of failure, need for love, and struggle to do right by family are deeply familiar. the comedy coding makes the emotional medicine easier to swallow.
Viewers connect with Peter because underneath all the cartoon chaos, there's something recognizably human, trying and failing to navigate a complicated world. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown.
After examining all these aspects of Peter's psychology and appeal, we can now reflect on what this entire analysis teaches us about understanding characters psychologically and what that reveals about ourselves as viewers.
Section 12.
What Peter Griffin's behaviors tell us about ourselves. After spending this entire video examining Peter Griffin through a psychological lens, looking at his impulsivity, his emotional dysregulation, his substance use, his cognitive deficits, his social dysfunction, and all the other patterns we've discussed, we can step back and ask what this exercise has taught us. Analyzing a fictional character as if they were a real person might seem like an academic exercise with no practical value. But this kind of analysis actually reveals important things about how we understand human behavior, how storytelling works, and how we relate to the media we consume. The first lesson from this psychological exploration is that consistent behavioral patterns create character coherence. When we watch Family Guy across hundreds of episodes spanning more than 2 decades, Peter behaves in recognizable ways. He has stable traits and predictable responses. This consistency is what makes him feel like a character rather than just a collection of random jokes written week to week. The psychological frameworks we've used to understand Peter work because the writers, whether intentionally or not, have created behavioral consistency. Real psychological patterns emerge because the character has been written with an internal logic, even if that logic is the logic of severe dysfunction. Understanding Peter psychologically also helps us appreciate the craft of character creation in animated comedy. The writers have to balance making Peter dysfunctional enough to create comedy while keeping him functional enough to sustain a story across decades. They've given him severe impairments in some areas while preserving just enough capability in others to allow the show to continue. This balance reveals something about how storytelling works. Characters need enough consistency to be recognizable, and enough variability to create different stories. Peter's psychological profile allows both. He's reliably impulsive and emotionally volatile, but those traits can manifest in endless different situations and scenarios. The analysis also demonstrates how psychology provides vocabulary and frameworks for describing behavior that might otherwise be hard to articulate. Instead of just saying, Peter is stupid or mean, we can talk about executive dysfunction, emotional dysregulation, and attachment issues. These concepts give us precise language for patterns we observe. This precision helps us see more clearly. When we name something accurately, we understand it better. The psychological lens brings aspects of Peter's character into sharper focus than casual viewing would allow. We move from vague impressions to specific observations about cognitive processes, emotional patterns, and social behaviors. Looking at Peter through this lens also reveals the relationship between comedy and tragedy. Many of the patterns we've identified would be deeply sad in a real person. Severe cognitive impairment, alcohol use disorder, childhood trauma, inability to maintain relationships, these are sources of genuine suffering in the real world. The show transmutes this suffering into comedy through exaggeration, through the cartoon medium, through the episodic reset that prevents consequences from accumulating, and through framing that encourages laughter rather than empathy. Understanding the psychological reality underneath the comedy helps us see how humor often derives from pain transformed. The same behavioral patterns that create laughter in animation would create concern and sadness if we encountered them in real life. The exercise of psychological analysis also highlights how we use frameworks to make sense of complex phenomena. Human behavior is incredibly complicated. Psychology offers organizing principles that help us find patterns and make predictions. By applying these principles to Peter, we've taken something chaotic and found structure in it. This is what our minds do constantly, trying to organize the overwhelming complexity of human social life into manageable concepts. Seeing this process applied to a fictional character makes visible the interpretive work we do all the time with real people. We're always trying to understand why people do what they do, and we use psychological frameworks to make that understanding possible. Examining Peter's environment and how it maintains his dysfunction teaches us about the power of social context in shaping behavior. Peter doesn't exist in isolation. He lives in Quahog with specific people who respond to him in specific ways. The environment enables his problems rather than correcting them. This observation applies beyond fiction. Real people exist in social contexts that either support healthy functioning or enable dysfunction. Understanding how environments shape individuals helps us think more systemically about behavioral problems, recognizing that individual change often requires environmental change. We cannot understand Peter without understanding Quahog, just as we cannot understand real people without understanding their social worlds. The analysis also demonstrates the limitations of individual-focused explanations. We can describe everything wrong with Peter's brain and behavior, but that description doesn't fully explain him without also understanding his relationships, his history, his community, and the social forces acting on him. Human beings are not isolated psychological systems. We're embedded in networks of relationships and cultural contexts that profoundly shape who we become and how we function. Peter's character illustrates this embeddedness, even though he's fictional. His dysfunction makes sense only when we consider his father's abuse, his friends' enabling, his workplace's tolerance, and his community's dysfunction. Looking at the social commentary functions of Peter's character shows how entertainment media can work as cultural reflection and critique. By exaggerating certain behavioral patterns and social tendencies, the show holds up a mirror to aspects of American culture. Peter embodies, taken to extremes, certain values like individualism, immediate gratification, anti-intellectualism, and freedom from constraint. Seeing these values pushed to their logical conclusions helps us examine them more critically. The psychological analysis enhances our ability to see what the show is commenting on and how it uses Peter to make those comments. Comedy becomes a vehicle for cultural criticism when we understand what's being exaggerated and why. The discussion of relatability reveals something important about how we connect with stories and characters. We don't only identify with characters who are like us or who represent ideals. We also connect with characters who express parts of ourselves we normally suppress, or who act out fantasies we don't allow ourselves to pursue. Peter lets us experience through fiction things we couldn't or wouldn't do in reality. Understanding this function of entertainment helps us think about what media consumption does for us psychologically and what needs it serves. We watch Peter partly to see impulses we control acted out without consequence. This vicarious experience provides satisfaction while maintaining our real-world behavioral control. The entire exercise also demonstrates that taking things seriously can deepen rather than diminish enjoyment. Some might think that analyzing comedy ruins it by explaining the jokes or by treating lighthearted entertainment as if it deserves serious attention. But engaging thoughtfully with media we enjoy often enriches the experience. We notice more. We understand more deeply. We see connections and patterns we would miss with purely surface-level consumption. The psychological analysis of Peter doesn't make Family Guy less funny, it makes it more interesting. Laughter and analysis can coexist. Understanding why something is funny or how it works doesn't eliminate the pleasure of experiencing it. Examining Peter's character arc, or rather his lack of one, teaches us something about the difference between episodic comedy and serialized storytelling. Peter doesn't grow or change because the show's structure doesn't require or reward character development. Each episode returns to a baseline. This approach to storytelling serves different purposes than narratives that track character transformation over time. Understanding why Peter remains static helps us appreciate different modes of storytelling and what each accomplishes. Some stories are about change and growth. Others are about exploring variations on stable themes. Family Guy belongs to the second category, and Peter's unchanging nature is essential to how the show functions. The analysis also shows how fictional characters can serve as case studies for understanding psychological concepts. Students learning about executive dysfunction, emotional regulation, or substance use disorders could examine Peter as an illustration. While he's not a real patient and shouldn't be treated as one, his behavioral patterns demonstrate principles clearly enough to aid learning. Fiction can make abstract concepts concrete and memorable. Peter's character could genuinely help someone understand what severe impulsivity looks like in practice. The exaggeration inherent in comedy actually makes patterns more visible, not less. By amplifying traits to absurd levels, the show makes them easier to recognize and understand. Looking at all the observable patterns we've discussed across these sections reminds us that behavior is multiply determined. There's never one single cause for why someone acts the way they do. Peter's dysfunction stems from brain damage and alcohol use and developmental trauma and cognitive limitations and environmental enabling and attachment issues and more. All these factors interact and influence each other. This complexity is true for real people as well. Simple explanations for human behavior are almost always incomplete. The psychological richness of Peter's character, even though he's fictional, illustrates this complexity. When we try to explain why Peter does what he does, we need multiple levels of analysis, from neural to social to cultural. The discussion of diagnostic observations, even framed as non-clinical, raises questions about the relationship between categories and reality. When we apply diagnostic frameworks to Peter, we're imposing structure on something the writers created for different purposes. The diagnoses don't exist in Peter. They exist in how we organize and interpret his behavior. This reminds us that psychological categories are tools for understanding, not truths about the world. They're useful organizing principles, but they're human creations that we apply to experience rather than objective features we discover. The same is true when we apply these categories to real people. Diagnoses are interpretive frameworks that help us organize observations and guide treatment, not natural kinds we find in nature. The entire analysis also reveals something about how we think about responsibility and judgment. Throughout this examination, we've described Peter's behavior in psychological and neurological terms, identifying deficits and impairments. This framework can reduce moral judgment because it explains behavior in terms of dysfunction rather than choice. If Peter's brain doesn't work properly, can we blame him for his actions? This question applies to real people too. Understanding the psychological and biological bases of behavior complicates simple moral judgments, while also raising questions about how to respond to harmful behavior regardless of its causes. Explaining behavior doesn't automatically excuse it, but it does change how we think about accountability and appropriate responses. Examining Peter across all these dimensions demonstrates the value of sustained attention and systematic analysis. Rather than just watching episodes and forming impressions, we've carefully examined specific patterns across multiple episodes and multiple psychological domains. This systematic approach reveals things that casual observation misses. The lesson applies beyond analyzing television characters. Sustained, careful attention to any phenomenon typically reveals complexity and pattern that quick judgments overlook. The discipline of looking closely matters. Whether we're trying to understand a fictional character, a real person, a social problem, or any other complex phenomenon, taking time to observe carefully and think systematically produces better understanding than quick impressions. The process of this analysis also shows how different frameworks highlight different aspects of the same phenomenon. We've looked at Peter through lenses of cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, social psychology, and more. Each perspective illuminates something different. No single framework captures everything. This pluralism of perspectives applies to understanding real people and real behavior as well. Multiple valid ways of understanding usually exist, and holding several perspectives simultaneously provides richer comprehension than any single view alone. The cognitive lens shows us Peter's thinking problems. The emotional lens shows us his regulation failures. The social lens shows us his relationship dysfunction. Together, these perspectives create a more complete picture than any one could provide. Finally, taking Peter seriously as a subject of psychological analysis dignifies both the character and the show. It treats Family Guy as worthy of thoughtful engagement rather than as mere disposable entertainment. This doesn't mean the show is perfect or that every episode deserves praise. It means that popular entertainment can reward close attention and systematic analysis. The culture we consume, even when it's silly cartoon comedy, reflects and shapes how we think and what we value. Taking it seriously enough to analyze carefully is a way of taking ourselves and our culture seriously. Media matters because it occupies our attention, influences our thinking, and provides frameworks for understanding ourselves and others. Looking at Peter Griffin through a psychological lens over the course of this video has been an exercise in applied psychology, media analysis, and cultural criticism. We've used real psychological concepts to understand a fictional character, and in doing so, we've learned about those psychological concepts, about how storytelling works, about social commentary and comedy, and about why we connect with flawed characters. The analysis demonstrates that even something as seemingly frivolous as an animated sitcom can teach us important things about human behavior, social dynamics, and ourselves when we engage with it thoughtfully and systematically. Peter Griffin remains a cartoon character designed to make us laugh.
But examining him carefully reveals layers of meaning and pattern that enrich our appreciation for both the character and the psychological principles that help us understand him.
If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.